After the release of Sonic the Hedgehog, the original Sonic team split. Programmer Yuji Naka and game designer Hirokazu Yasuhara would leave for the US to work on Sonic 2. Meanwhile, the artist behind Sonic, Naoto Oshima, would stay behind in Japan and be tasked with creating a version of Sonic for the brand new Sega CD. But, as it was for the Sega CD, that meant many people, including myself, probably didn't have a chance to play Sonic CD until Sonic Gems Collection. Even as that's the case, Sonic CD has built up a massive fanbase, with many considering it the best of the classic Sonic games. So let's dive into what makes Sonic CD so unique and what design decisions were made. For those of you just joining me, this is my third video looking at classic Sonic games, so I won't be going over mechanics I already discussed in the previous two videos which looked at Sonics 1 and 2. Before talking about game design, let's look at the development history that went into creating Sonic CD. According to Naoto Oshima, Sonic CD was made in Japan, while Sonic 2 was made by Yuji Naka's team over in the US. We exchanged information, of course, talking about the sort of game design each of us was aiming for, but Sonic CD wasn't Sonic 2. It was really meant to be more of a CD version of the original Sonic. I can't help but wonder, therefore, if we had more fun making CD than they did making Sonic 2, because we didn't have the pressure of making a numbered sequel. I've seen reference on Wikipedia and other random sources that Sonic CD was originally meant to be a port of Sonic the Hedgehog 1, but the only quote I could find that references anything like that is the one I just presented from Naoto Oshima. It's worth noting there are some old magazine clippings that reference Sonic CD was meant to be a Sega CD re-release of Sonic 2, but those are from foreign, non-Japanese outlets who, it strikes me, are just speculating and really have no clue as to what was actually happening behind the scenes. So, taking all of that into mind, I'm honestly not sure if what Naoto Oshima was saying was that Sonic CD was originally a port of Sonic 1. As it was meant to be a CD version of the original Sonic, it sounds like it was more so meant to be an enhanced game, to me, but still something original. And that's why the team had little pressure, because it wasn't called Sonic 2 and was more so a spin-off. But hey, I could be wrong. So, Sonic CD came about as Sega wanted a Sonic game for their upcoming Sega CD. This was around the same time that Sonic 2 was already in development, meaning Sonic 2 and Sonic CD would both be in development at the same time, although Sonic 2 did get a head start. That said, the Sega CD released to Japan in December of 1991, North America in October 1992, and beyond in 1993. So with Sonic CD releasing in late 1993, that meant that it wasn't anything near a launch title for the Sega CD. While Hirokazu Yasuhara played with the idea of time travel for Sonic 2, this idea was eventually dropped due to limited development time. According to Hirokazu Yasuhara, he didn't discuss these plans with Naoto Oshima at all, and coincidentally, Naoto Oshima would put a heavy focus onto time travel and exploration for Sonic CD. Interestingly, the codebase used for Sonic CD would be the very same code that Yuji Naka had written for the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Not only did that save time, I'm sure, but it also likely shows just how impressive Yuji Naka's code was, as the team didn't seem to want to touch it. Naoto Oshima originally wanted the time travel of Sonic 2 to be instantaneous, rather than having a loading section as in the final product. According to Naoto Oshima, the programmer of Sonic CD, Matsuhide Mizoguchi, told him this was impossible to do on the Sega CD, and thus they needed a loading screen. Oshima-san stated, "I kept fighting and fighting with the programmers, but they said it just wasn't possible." However, Oshima-san later stated, "I know, if Naka was doing the programming, I think it could have been done." Again, really showing to me how much the team must have respected Yuji Naka's capabilities as a programmer. One more fun quote I want to bring up is one from designer Masato Nishimura. In a 1993 interview translated by Shmuplations, the team was asked, "How does your staff on Sonic CD feel about the previous Sonic games?" And Masato Nishimura responds, I'd say there are rivals. As a creator, we don't see them as allies but as something to overcome. To be honest though, we feel that sense of rivalry with every game out there today. So, kind of a fun way to look at how they probably looked at Sonic CD as a game that they wanted to be better than Sonic 1 and 2, which I think any creator would want their game to be. As Sonic CD would release, at first exclusively for the Sega CD, that did limit how many people would end up playing the game. The Sega CD, for reference, sold around 2.24 to 2.25 million units worldwide, and with that, Sonic CD became the best-selling game for the system, with sales surpassing 1.5 million. As an interesting note, while Sonic CD originally released in 1993, the game was actually ported to PC in 1995 and 96, although I'm not sure how well those sold. Either way, compare that to Sonic 2 selling over 6 million copies worldwide, and Sonic 1 selling over 14 million copies worldwide, although that does include copies packed in with the Sega Genesis. Point being, I'm sure there were many people, like me, who didn't have a chance to play Sonic CD until it would later be re-released on something like Sonic Gems Collection or the more recent Sonic Origins. Boot up Sonic CD, and a 3D Sonic will turn into the title screen. This title screen takes a lot of cues from the original Sonic the Hedgehog, more so than Sonic 2. For starters, Sonic 1 shows off all of its parallax scrolling right from the start, likely because not only does it look cool, but it acts as a nice technical showcase for the power of the game. Sonic 2 subdued this, favoring only one moving element in the background, with a title that might not be the same graphical showcase, but is cleaner overall. Sonic CD, once again, uses its title to show off the power of, this time, the Sega CD. The most notable things are the emblem and Sonic himself. From an interview with designer Kazuyuki Hoshino, he states, "In terms of the graphics, our biggest theme for Sonic CD was CG. This game would be for the brand new Mega CD, so we wanted to include new ideas distinct from the previous Sonic games. We needed to stand out somehow. To create that image of Sonic turning to face you, we used a Polaroid camera to take pictures of a Sonic figurine, scan them, and use that as our base to create the animation. To provide contrast and highlight Sonic himself, we made the emblem behind him look metallic to provide an overall impression of CG. At the time, CG meant sparkling, sheen metallic surfaces that immediately jumped out at you and yelled, 'This is CG!' And frankly, I thought that aesthetic was the height of cool." On a personal level, while it's hard for me to comment on how much wow factor this had at the time since I didn't have a Sega CD, I do think the emblems and Sonics for Sonic 1 and 2 look cleaner, as that's just the nature of new technology with it sometimes not aging as well. The other interesting thing about this, to me, is it looks like the Sonic model here is the same as the Sonic from the original Sonic the Hedgehog. I commented on my last video how Sonic got a slight facelift in the emblem for Sonic 2, and of these three, I still think he looks the best there with him having some more hard edges and a deeper blue. It's also a shame because, like so many others, I think the art style of Sonic for the cutscenes of Sonic CD is some of the best Sonic art to ever grace us. I do also enjoy the style for the cutscenes of Sonic Mania and Sonic Origins, but I think those were based on Sonic CD's art style. Point being, it's a shame we didn't get to see an emblem with the cutscene art style of Sonic. Back to the graphical showcase of Sonic CD's title screen, like Sonic 1, it shows off a massive amount of parallax scrolling for the water, but not just that, the clouds at the top of the screen appear to fly at players. This is particularly notable because it looks, to me, like this is using a type of scaling and rotation that, while capable on the Super Nintendo and known there as Mode 7, wasn't possible on the Sega Genesis. So, like how the parallax scrolling was a graphical showcase for both Sonic and the Sega Genesis and Sonic 1, this Mode 7-esque scaling of the clouds is, once again, a unique graphical showcase of something only the Sega CD was capable of that the Sega Genesis wasn't. All in all, this title screen immediately shows off a sense of speed and graphical prowess, like Sonic 1's title, and I think it's successful in that. On a subjective level, I happen to like the cleanness of Sonic 2's title screen the most of these three I've talked about so far, but it's still a fun title screen nonetheless. In a nice quality of life feature, Sonic CD is the first Sonic game to include saving. If you're playing the game straight through, I don't think Sonic CD is as long as Sonic 2, but if you're exploring and looking for all of the robot transporters, or robot generators,
I see it referred to as both, although the Sonic Wiki refers to it as the robot transporter, so that's probably what's right. Anyways, if you're looking for all of these, that will far extend your playtime, especially making the save system a nice quality of life feature. I don't think Sonic 1 was really long enough to warrant the need for this feature, but it is interesting that Sonic 2 forgoes it when it was technically possible at the time internally for cartridges. Sonic CD, I believe, uses the Sega CD hard drive for its saving. The save system also works in tandem with the time attack of Sonic CD, where players can only access levels they've beaten in the main game for the time attack. I'm sure there's a small sect of players who think saving ruins the idea of making it through everything in one run, but I don't see it that way, as you never know when you'll need to turn off the game, so this is a welcome feature in my book. I read that the original Sonic CD only had one save file, but this was something I felt I needed to test for myself. So, luckily, I actually bought a Sega CD and another game I'd always wanted, Pop Full Mail, for a video I made years ago. So, I bought Sonic CD and decided to test this out myself, as well as some other things I wanted to check since I didn't grow up with this game. And as it turns out, there is indeed only one save file. There's no save function, but rather the game autosaves, seemingly after finishing an entire zone, rather than individual acts. So finish Palmtree Panic Act 3, and the game will save your progress. Boot up the game again, and the game will automatically go to a continue selection. However, there's only one save file, and if you go to New Game, this will automatically write over any game that's currently in progress, just for starting a new game. I'm not sure if that was a limitation of the Sega CD itself, but in comparison to Sonic 3, which lets players have multiple save files, this certainly feels odd. I'm aware that Sonic CD released before Sonic 3, but multiple save files on console games have been a thing since, at the very least, Zelda 1 released in 1986. And I can definitely see a world where siblings are playing the game, and one sibling accidentally, or intentionally, overwrites the other sibling's game, destroying their progress and causing some frustration. So that will be my one critique of this, but still, a nice feature to have even if it's slightly flawed. Press start in the newer versions of Sonic CD, and you'll be treated to the opening cutscene. However, interestingly, this is actually a little different from the original version of Sonic CD. In the original version, if players wait on the title screen long enough, that's when the opening animation will play. Pressing start will immediately take players to Palmtree Panic. In newer versions, like Sonic Origins, waiting on the title screen will instead bring up different gameplay sequences, both from stages and special stages, like the original Sonic games did. This is such a great opening sequence that I appreciate the change to make sure players don't miss it. Although, to be fair, it doesn't really explain anything, so I can see why the team originally decided not to force players into watching this. There is something to be said for using a gameplay sequence to teach players how to play a game. Sonic 1 does this by simply showing elements of gameplay, and Sonic 2 does this by showing off the spin dash. So what's odd about the future Sonic CD inclusions of this is that it doesn't actually show off anything. You do have a sequence showing getting a time stone from a special stage, but both the spin dash and super peel out aren't showcased, which is a really odd choice. On top of that, what's arguably one of the most important aspects of Sonic CD, and somewhat obscure for new players, are destroying the robot transporters / generators, and that isn't shown either. That's not on the original Sonic CD team, as, again, they didn't choose to include these gameplay showcases, but I do think whatever team chose to do it didn't do a great job. On the opening sequence itself, we see Sonic head over to Little Planet, see that it's connected by a chain, and that Dr. Robotnik's face is on the side of the mountain with the chain that's connected to Little Planet. But really, it's just a cool showcase of Sonic running and jumping through obstacles as he ends up heading onto Little Planet. The actual story explaining what's going on is relegated to the instruction manual, but North American players were, treated to a rewrite that adds Princess Sally into it. It's likely whoever wrote the North American version was thinking of Amy and used the wrong character, as Princess Sally already existed in Sonic media and was someone else, or it was the battling of Sega of America with Sega of Japan over characters. Princess Sally originated from the kinda infamous Sonic Bible written by Sega of America in 1991. So this could have been Sega of America trying to put their version stamp on Sonic CD. The actual story is fairly basic, with Sonic going to check out Neverlake and Little Planet, for some reason, only to discover Dr. Robotnik had taken it over and going to save the day. Meanwhile, Robotnik had established a fortress on Little Planet in order to obtain the Time Stones so he could take over the world. And that's it. But it's not like we really need anything complex here for a fun game. As I mentioned earlier, I absolutely adore the art style for Sonic in this cutscene, and it really does succeed in making Sonic look cool as hell, and like how I, at least, imagined myself when I was playing Sonic games.
Something that is worth noting about the differences between the original cutscene and newer remastered cutscene is that there's a portion that's actually cut out from the newer version. This part shows Little Planet and its chain, then reveals Robotnik's face is the one holding the planet, immediately showing the problem and why Sonic needs to go there. This footage in the remastered version is reversed. But not only that, it starts after the Robotnik face reveal would have been, simply revealing Little Planet connected to a chain. I'm guessing this has to do with how many animation frames there were, and perhaps the version that was originally redrawn for the Sega CD had less animation frames and was therefore slightly shorter. The music was then timed and written to this version. So, when the remastered footage was released, something had to get cut for the music to still match, and this is what we lost. Now, the newer version is extended in that there are more scenes of cool Sonic action. Like this cool sequence of Sonic running so fast through water he creates rainbows? Not in the original. There are actually so many added fun little scenes, I'm not going to list them all. I get that you don't want to lose any of the cool Sonic action, but this is pretty integral as it's the only real clue in the animation as to the plot of the game. I didn't know this part of the animation existed until I was recording footage on my Sega CD, and it feels like a key piece. It also alters the whole idea behind, look, here's a planet, then the reveal of Robotnik being behind something dastardly. So honestly, as much as I love the fun Sonic action, I think something should have been cut, or one to a few scenes had slightly less time in order to make sure this part was included. We start the game off in Palmtree Panic, but before I get to the level design and ideas behind Palmtree Panic, I want to talk about some of the mechanics shifts for Sonic CD, as these will make a pretty huge difference in the gameplay. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I'm not going to go over mechanics I already discussed in my Sonic 1 or 2 video unless there was a change. And the first major new mechanic we get in Sonic CD is the Super Peel Out. But while I'm talking about the Super Peel Out, we also need to discuss spin dashing, which originated in Sonic 2 as they're so similar. Both moves are a way for Sonic to instantly accelerate from a stop to top speed. I know there are major fans of Sonic 1 who don't like these moves, but I, myself, am a huge fan, and as I discussed in my Sonic 2 video, I actually think this is not only fun to do, but opens the door to more design opportunities. So my feelings on the Super Peel Out overall are pretty similar to the Spin Dash in that I think it's a lot of fun to use, and the animation with the infinity sign is super cool looking. But what's different about the two moves? The most obvious factor is that the Super Peel Out sends Sonic running at top speed, while the Spin Dash sends Sonic rolling at top speed. To perform a Spin Dash, hold down and tap the jump button, then let go of down. To perform a Super Peel Out, hold up and tap the jump button, then let go of up. I was trying to do some research on further differences, and I saw comments on Reddit where people claim the Super Peel Out has a faster speed than the Spin Dash, but I actually don't know if this is correct. I checked Sonic Retro's physics guide for differences, and their guide is one I trust far more than a random person on Reddit, and according to Sonic Retro, after 45 frames, the Spin Dash will launch Sonic spinning at a ground speed of 12. The Super Peel Out, meanwhile, will only take 30 frames to charge. The guide doesn't say exactly how fast Sonic will go, but instead just says it works in the same fashion. So I'm guessing the same speed, although I'm not sure. From a totally separate article on Sonic Retro about the Super Peel Out, it does say this goes slightly faster than the Spin Dash, but it doesn't specify how much faster, and frankly, I trust the physics guide a little more. I decided to do some of my own tests on this. It was difficult because of how consistently the ground slopes, as that's part of the interesting, unique thing that Sonic can do over other games, so it's always doing this, even if it's slight. But from what I can tell, I'm pretty sure the starting speeds are the exact same. in both of the examples I'm showing here, the super peel out ends up with a slight edge in speed over the spin dash due to the sloped terrain, and I guess the spin dash is losing slightly more momentum going uphill than it's gaining going downhill, or simply because the spin dash rolling is getting affected by ground friction. But if you look at the very start of the moves, they seem to be going at equal speeds. So the reason the super peel out might feel faster is due to how physics works with spinning compared to running. If players are holding forwards while running, even though there's ground friction, they'll maintain their top speed. However, while players are rolling, the roll friction will apply to them, and players are at the whims of the terrain in terms of how fast they go. So, on flat ground or ground that slopes upwards, Sonic will maintain his max speed while doing the super peel out, but continually decelerate while rolling from a spin dash. However, if Sonic is traveling downhill, Sonic will maintain the same running max speed after a super peel out, but actually pick up momentum and speed from gravity if spin dashing and go faster than a super peel out. This isn't super obvious in Sonic CD, and I wouldn't blame you for not noticing, because it's not like Sonic CD has a level like Chemical Plant Zone from Sonic 2, where there's a massive downwards ramp for Sonic to build up insane speed from rolling. There's also springs, bumpers, and walls everywhere in the level design of Sonic CD overall, even in some of the faster stages like Stardust Speedway, and typically, it feels like you're going to be using these moves to travel up ramps rather than quickly making forwards progress. So I think that's where the super peel out definitely has the advantage. So, if you're going up a ramp or on level terrain and aren't worried about enemies, the super peel out has the advantage. If you're going downhill or want to have protection from enemies, the spin dash has the advantage. As Sonic is running during the super peel out and spinning from the spin dash, it means, as per usual, Sonic can destroy enemies while spinning, but will take damage from enemies if running. That said, you can always perform a super peel out, then immediately press down to roll, making the move essentially the same thing as a spin dash. As these moves are so similar though, does it even make sense to have the super peel out? Because interestingly, the super peel out was dropped from most future 2D Sonic games or relegated to being a secret. This isn't a ding on the move itself, but I guess it has to do with simplicity. The two moves do give players a little bit to think about in terms of which one is going to be better for each given situation, and to that extent, some players are going to enjoy this because it adds a minor level of complexity and quick thinking. But if you're aiming for simplicity, it is so similar to a spin dash, especially because you can press down and make it essentially the same thing. There's a point where you have to ask, is this needed, and how much does it really add to the game? Are you going to design around this move making specific situations where it's the preferable choice? Or is it simply going to be there as an additional move players can do? Because, frankly, you could continue down that line with any move and make slight variations players can do with a slightly different button combination. It would add complexity, but does it truly make the game better? I'm not answering that question for you because it's a subjective question, and it's going to come down to what level of minutia designers want their players to have control of, and for each individual player, how much the move truly adds to the game or possibly adds a layer of unneeded complexity. For my part, in Sonic CD, I found myself using the super peel out far more frequently than the spin dash because there were so many longer ramps I wanted to go up that it felt like the super peel out was more so the ideal move for. I also think it looks cooler in motion than a spin dash. But I admittedly wouldn't say it necessarily added to my experience or I thought I was having more fun because I was using the super peel out over a spin dash. In fact, frequently, I thought I was being dumb for choosing it because there could be an enemy I'd run into, whereas I'd be safe with the spin dash. A lot of times, it really was because a lot of the giant ramps I'd be backtracking over felt specifically designed for using the super peel out in Sonic CD, and eventually, it kind of became more a part of my muscle memory over a spin dash. So, another question then arises. You're making a new Sonic game, and you've decided for simplicity's sake, you only want one move. The spin dash or the super peel out? What do you choose? I would guess the answer became spin dash for many future titles, partially because of how iconic it became, but partially because it is even more simple than the super peel out. If you want to spin and be safe and you perform a super peel out, you still need to press down to roll. But the nice thing about a spin dash is that it immediately puts players into a rolling state. So if you want to run, then you simply run. If you want to spin, the spin dash is an ideal way to do this.
And on top of that, the spin dash does work as both an offensive and defense tool immediately, versus a super peel out, which requires a little more button pressing and thought. And for the sake of making a massive game with a huge, widespread fan base of players of varying skill levels, the spin dash is the tool that's more accessible for this reason. Something else interesting about the spin dash and super peel out of Sonic CD is how it functions versus the spin dash of Sonic 2, and really any future Sonic game, including remakes of Sonic CD. In the original Sonic CD, or as an option in something like Sonic Origins, the super peel out and spin dash charge up by tapping it once, and then players need to wait a set period of time before they release up or down to shoot forwards. Players need to wait 30 frames in the case of the super peel out, and 45 frames in the case of the spin dash. This is a very different style of control over how Sonic 2 handles its spin dash. For Sonic 2 and most Sonic games, players will rev up their spin dash by quickly tapping the action button. The power of the spin dash increases with each button press, but slowly drops over time, meaning that if players want to shoot forwards at maximum speed, they'll need to tap as quickly as they can before releasing. This also meant that players had a choice to alter their speed by either waiting or tapping less times. In Sonic CD, with both moves, players only tap once and then wait. If they let go of up or down before the move finishes charging, they won't move at all. Then, if they do let go after waiting, they'll immediately shoot forwards at max speed. It's also worth mentioning, by the way, from testing this in both the original Sonic CD on Sega CD and Sonic CD in Sonic Origins, even this functions differently in remakes. In Sonic Origins, if players let go of the up or down button immediately after starting to charge a spin dash or super peel out, they won't move at all. But if it's before finishing the charge and after waiting for a little bit of time, they'll still shoot forwards, but at a smaller speed. In the original Sonic CD, no matter what, if players hadn't finished charging up their spin dash or super peel out and let go, they ain't moving at all. So this is a change from Sonic 2 that I honestly don't like and feel is a downgrade, and I think that's probably a common sentiment, at least at Sega, as re-releases of Sonic CD, or at least Sonic Origins, has Sonic 2's version of how a spin dash is handled as the default for both the super peel out and spin dash, with players revving it up. Revving up the spin dash feels fun because it's like revving up an engine. It also gives players far more control, as they can choose the speed, and it even creates a mini game within itself to see how quickly players can mash the button and see if they can manage to go at top speed. On top of that, the players are constantly doing something. Even though you're technically waiting, the player is actively controlling the speed. However, with the way Sonic CD handles its spin dash and super peel out, it really is a case of players just waiting and doing nothing. And I'm not against the fact that moves have to charge up. I think that makes sense given the power of the moves, but I do think Sonic 2, which was released earlier, handled it better. It's also worth noting that while the super peel out is super cool visually, the spin dash doesn't look as good in Sonic CD as it does in Sonic 2. Sonic 2 had a very specific animation for the spin dash, where dust was kicking up, and Sonic's ball slanted in the direction players wanted to go. However, Sonic CD's spin dash is simply the same animation as his roll. I'm not sure why that is, as there are plenty of unique animations in Sonic CD, and I would guess the team probably would have had time for this. It makes me wonder if it was a case of them not wanting to copy Sonic 2, or for some reason not being allowed to. This also makes me wonder if the spin dash was added to Sonic CD because of Sonic 2. If you recall, for a period of time, the games were in development at the same time. So I wonder if the teams separately came up with acceleration solutions. Yuji Naka, Hirokazu Yasuhara, and STI came up with the spin dash, and Naoto Oshima and Sega of Japan separately came up with the super peel out. But Sonic 2 released in November 1992, nearly a full year before Sonic CD's September 1993 release date. Then, when Sonic 2 released, the spin dash was so popular or viewed as such a great tool, perhaps Sonic CD's team were forced to add the spin dash in by Sega, or decided they needed to add it after seeing Sonic 2. That's obviously speculation, but it kinda makes sense to me. I think it's clear that the team who worked on Sonic 1 all thought afterwards, partially due to feedback as Hirokazu Yasuhara noted, that there needed to be a way to accelerate faster. Naoto Oshima does state that both the US and Japanese team exchanged some notes, but I have a feeling they came to separate conclusions as to how to handle instant acceleration. and this theory of mine would make a lot of sense for why both the super peel out and spin dash, which are incredibly similar, are both in Sonic CD. Again, this is me speculating, and I could be wrong, so take that with a grain of salt, but I find it interesting to think about. Going back to needing to wait to perform a super peel out and spin dash, I do think there's more reason to it than simply waiting for the sake of waiting and it charging. And that all has to do with Sonic CD's brand new camera functionality. When players start charging one of these moves, you'll notice that the camera shifts position to allow the player to see further ahead of Sonic and less behind him, as Sonic will no longer be centered. And it's possible the waiting period was actually a way to smoothly move the camera without it being too jarring, and that's the true reason for this charge time. So, that moving camera is something interesting to me, because it's actually something I, funny enough, mentioned in my Sonic 1 analysis and completely forgot Sonic CD did. With Sonic moving as fast as he does at different points, I do think sometimes it would have been nice for the camera to be zoomed out a little bit more, as that can cause problems in knowing and predicting where Sonic will end up. At full speed, unless players have the map memorized, it really starts to feel like luck as to what you'll run into or hit. And while some people might find that to be fun about Sonic, while I do like his speed, I think any way to show more of the action might have been a positive thing. Something that is an option, by the way, but probably not possible during the Sega Genesis days, is zooming out the camera as Sonic picks up speed, then zooming back in the camera once Sonic slows down. It might have been too much movement, or maybe make people dizzy, but in modern games that is an option. Another option is what I mentioned Donkey Kong Country did, where the camera whips in the direction the player is facing, showing more in front of the player, but less behind them. That's something Sonic might have benefited from in allowing players to see more of where they're going, although it's hard to tell for sure how it would have felt, positive or negative, unless I were to actually experiment and test it. So thank you to Osart Damien, Kid Pracord95 or Kid Pratchord95, or sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, and Arda48355 for pointing out I missed this in my Sonic 1 video. Interestingly, Sonic Origins, which is where I've been primarily recording, actually removes the moving camera if you're playing with the Sega Genesis Spin Dash, and that's how the game is automatically set up. I didn't realize that, and this is how I was playing at first, so that's also partially why I missed this. So, to my point from my Sonic 1 video on cameras and Sonic moves so quickly at max speed, it can be hard to see and react in time to what's in front of the player. So there are various solutions like zooming out the camera or moving the camera when Sonic picks up speed. Sonic CD goes for the latter. Once Sonic begins to pick up a certain amount of speed, the camera shifts positions to allow players to see more in the direction they're running. But once Sonic stops or is hit, the camera then reverts to being centered. In general, I think this is a great addition, as it does, indeed, help players see and react. Sonic's moving so fast that it's not drastic in how much it helps, but it's still enough to be a nice touch. There is an interesting downside though, which is one of those things that's easier to notice in practice rather than predicting ahead. This comes in the form of what happens when Sonic hits a spring when the camera is shifted. And on top of that, what about if Sonic is running around loops or jumps off of a wall flying in the opposite direction? With Sonic CD, there are plenty of examples of this, as the game is filled with springs and interesting set pieces. From what I can tell looking at my footage, it seems like the camera doesn't adjust if Sonic is in the air, and that includes hitting a spring. So, if Sonic jumps off of a wall reversing the initial direction he was heading, the camera won't move, and now you have less you can see in the direction you're going than a standard camera. Similarly, if Sonic hits a spring in midair and reverses directions, I don't believe this changes the direction of the camera either. Although, if it's a grounded spring that's reversing Sonic's direction, then the camera seems to center out before reversing directions. There is an interesting example I have here where I hit a spring and the camera moves, but then the next sequence of springs doesn't cause the camera to move. My guess, although I could be mistaken, is that with the spring that causes the camera to move, Sonic was briefly grounded, so that's why the camera knew to move, whereas in the air, the camera doesn't move. I thought I'd be diligent and check Sonic Retro's physics guide to see if it had any info on this. According to the physics guide, when the ground speed, specifically, is more than or equal to 6, then the camera moves positions at a speed of 2. However, if the speed drops below 6, it then recenters. So if it is indeed ground speed that's the specific check, then it makes sense that the camera wouldn't adjust at all when Sonic is in the air. So, back to that downside, it does mean that there are specific instances when the camera will whip from one direction and then to another. On top of that, it also means there will be instances where Sonic is now seeing less than the default camera. If Sonic's momentum and direction, in general, were taken into account, that might have fixed the issue for when Sonic's in the air and reversing directions. But it does also mean the camera would be whipping back and forth far more frequently, which could be more of an issue. Perhaps a softer way to do this same idea would be a camera zooming out at high speeds, then zooming back in at low speeds. But I'm fairly certain that camera zooming wouldn't have been possible on the Sega Genesis or Sega CD hardware. Generally speaking though, in most situations, I think this is a nice touch. I pretty rarely, if at all, notice the downside to the way the camera functioned while playing. Even the camera whipping around was something I didn't notice at all in practice. Although, to be fair, that's just me. I'm sure there will be some people who will be very bothered by this. And that's where a camera that stays much more centered could potentially be more ideal for some. Bringing this back to the super peel out and spin dash, it's a nice touch that these moves automatically move the camera in the direction players are set to go. Although, I don't think there was a reason to force players to wait for the camera, if that was the reasoning for the wait time. With some basic mechanics out of the way, let's talk about the overall conceit of Sonic CD, time travel. This concept goes hand in hand with the robot transporters, but I'll be touching on how that shifts gameplay after talking about time travel more generally speaking. With Sonic CD, like Sonic 1, every zone has 3 acts, although with Sonic CD specifically, for some reason the terminology of all of this changes with zones being now called rounds and acts now being called zones. So technically there are 7 rounds which have 3 zones each, but I'ma be real with you, I far prefer the normal Sonic terminology of acts and zones, so I'm going to use that. So using normal Sonic terms, there are 7 zones in Sonic CD, each containing 3 acts. The first 2 acts are normal stages, with the third act being a mini stage with a boss. This is fairly similar to how Sonic 1 worked, although Sonic 1's third act was a full stage before a boss. The first 2 acts of each zone have 4 possible time states: the past, the present, a bad future, or a good future. Meanwhile, the final act only has a good future or bad future version, with this depending on if Sonic has found and destroyed the robot transporters in Acts 1 and 2, or if Sonic has collected all of the Time Stones, which is this game's version of Chaos Emeralds. In order to travel back and forth across time, Sonic will need to run into a signpost that indicates which direction in time he'll be traveling. From there, Sonic will need to travel at a certain speed for a certain period of time without slowing down. Air travel and ground travel are equal here, and reversing directions is fine only if hitting a spring or bumper. If players actively slow down or hit an enemy, it will stop the time travel momentum. If Sonic is successful, the time travel indicator will begin blinking. From here, players can slow down, on purpose or accidentally, and this will make Sonic lose the time travel sign and stay in whatever time he's currently in. However, if players continue traveling at enough speed while this is flashing, they'll travel through time. As I mentioned earlier, Naoto Oshima wanted this time travel to be instantaneous. However, due to programming limitations, either from the programmer on Sonic CD or simply the hardware itself, this time travel required a mini cutscene. It's interesting to think about what the game would have been with Naoto Oshima's desire, because it would have pretty drastically changed the game, for better or worse. But let's start with the game as it's designed. Something I noticed the team, and certain fans of Sonic CD, like to boast is how large the game is. Sonic 1 has 6 zones with 3 acts each, meaning the game has 18 stages. Sonic 2 has 11 zones, but these zones are 2 acts each per zone. On top of that, Death Egg Zone is just a boss stage, Metropolis Zone has 3 acts, and both Sky Chase Zone and Wing Fortress Zone only have 1 act. So really, that comes to 20 total stages, including Death Egg Zone. Sonic CD then has 7 zones with 3 acts. 2 of those acts have 4 versions, and 1 of those acts has 2 versions, meaning a total of 70 stages. In an interview with Sonic CD planner Hiroaki Chino, he was asked, "What do you feel some of the biggest changes have been
now that Sonic has made the jump from cartridge to CD. He responded, "A single regular stage will have past, present, and future to contend with. We could only bring that volume to life with the CD format. If you do a simple comparison with Sonic 2, it's 3 times the volume. But when you add in the secrets and other things overall, I think it's safe to say it has about 4 times the volume." I guess that's technically true. 70 stages of Sonic CD is 3.5 times more than 20 stages of Sonic 2. But it's also not really the whole picture, and that's because of how time travel really works in Sonic CD, partially, I'm sure, due to Naoto Oshima's desire for the stages to work like Back in the Future, and that want for the time travel to feel instantaneous. For the most part, the stages of Sonic CD, whether you're in the past, present, or either future, has the same overall stage design. Let's start with the good future and bad future. These stages are basically the exact same thing from a level design perspective. The stage is designed the same, with only the visuals and music changing, and the obstacles and enemies mostly being removed from the good future. Let's use Wacky Workbench as an example. One of the main obstacles of the stage is this background element that will create a shock and hurt players if they touch it. However, in the good future, this shock won't happen. Meanwhile, the actual layout of the stage is the exact same as the bad future version. In terms of past, present, future, the level layout is mostly pretty similar with only a few changes. What typically changes is the past tends to have easier obstacles and placements, with the bad future having the most difficult obstacles and obstacle placements. That's not to say the level layout never changes, it does, but practically, you can only do this so much because of the way the time travel works, as the idea is that it should feel pretty seamless with the stages feeling fairly similar, but in different time periods. And if Naoto Oshima had his way, the level layouts would have probably needed to be identical, or even more identical than they currently are in Sonic CD. Because if you're running and pick up speed to time travel and are successful, then you need to be transitioning to ground that exists, or the game needs to account for you suddenly being inside of a wall if the level layout is too different. Or the designers would have needed to absolutely ensure you can never go too fast to time travel at certain points in the stages where they deviate too much. I actually ran into an example of time travel breaking my game, and this was without that instantaneous time travel Naoto Oshima wanted. In Wacky Workbench, I traveled into a wall. A hatch opened up, so it seems I was supposed to eject from this wall, but something about the collision failed and I was just stuck in this box, needing to wait until time expired so I could restart the stage. So, because there's a loading screen between eras in Sonic CD, it allows the game to adjust where the player is if need be when they time travel during that loading, allowing the developers a little more leeway to alter the level layouts of each era if they want. You don't have to be exact in where the player ends up, it just needs to be relatively similar. So while instantaneous time travel would certainly be cool and visually pretty spectacular, is it really a boon to the level design? At that point, you probably need to make every era have the exact same stage layouts, or almost the exact same, and would need the obstacles to be the primary thing that changes. Even then, players might run into unfair moments where they time travel, and then end up on top of an obstacle that didn't exist in the era they were in before. Granted, you can give a player temporary iframes as soon as they time travel to somewhat mitigate that issue. I'm sure with a lot of careful planning, there is a way to avoid this. Sonic does need to travel fast and for a set period of time before being able to time travel. So look, if you want different level layouts, you need to ensure that these areas that diverge happen in sections there's no possible way players can time travel. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it can obviously be potentially limiting. As it stands, I actually don't think the levels are all that different between eras. As I mentioned, it feels like the terrain is altered to be slightly harder or easier, but I wouldn't go as far as to say these are totally separate stages. For the most part, they're so similar in their feel because of the similar level layout, obstacles, and enemies, that they feel more like remixes. There's also another way the team could have handled this, with the game having completely different level layouts per era. That would have achieved the goal of having all of these unique stages, but would then come with the drawback of each time zone feeling more disparate. So the pro of the time travel and the way it stands is you get these unique remixes of each stage, but the con is that there's a little less a reason to travel to each era due to this. If you're playing the game straight through, it feels more like a bit of a gimmicky feature that ends up being a little meaningless. And I imagine that many of the Sonic CD detractors are people who played this way. And to be honest with you, this was how I initially played the game, and I came away not at all impressed with Sonic CD. To be fair, it was a game I've been hyping up and wanting to play ever since I was a little kid growing up with a Sega Genesis, and didn't have a chance to play until over a decade after the initial release. So I definitely built the game up in my mind. But Naoto Oshima has talked about how he wanted the game to be about exploration. So, to that end, another element was added to Sonic CD that really feels like the intended way to play the game, at least to me, and totally changes the time travel dynamic. That element being the robot transporters, or robot generators. Pick your poison for how you want to refer to these. But before getting into the robot transporters, I want to dive a little deeper into the actual mechanic of traveling through time. As I mentioned, to do this, Sonic will need to maintain enough speed for a specific period of time. After that, he'll proceed to either the past or future, depending on which signpost he's activated. Naoto Oshima has stated in multiple interviews that a big inspiration for the time travel of Sonic CD was Back to the Future. So it actually ties in pretty neatly that in Back to the Future, the DeLorean had to hit a specific speed in order to travel through time. Meanwhile, Sonic's entire gimmick is about speed, so putting those together where Sonic needs to hit a certain speed to travel through time seems like the perfect match. The actual mechanic for traveling through time, though, is very deliberate from a gameplay standpoint and creates an interesting dynamic to the game. Generally speaking, the goal is to travel to the past, as that's where the robot transporters are. Destroying every robot transporter in Acts 1 and 2 of the game will net Sonic the good ending. So, sprinkled throughout the stages are signposts for both the past and future. But it feels like future signposts are a little more abundant, or at the very least, oftentimes, they seem placed in paths where players will be picking up the most speed. What this then creates is an interesting obstacle system, as traveling to the future is almost worse than getting hit by an enemy, and definitely worse if you're attempting to go for destroying all of the robot transporters to achieve the good ending. Because if you're in the past, you'll want to stay in the past, and traveling to the future will take you back to the present, meaning you'll have to once again search for a way to the past. Traveling to the future from the present takes players to the bad future if they hadn't destroyed the Axe robot transporter, which is the more challenging remix of the stage, meaning it's even further and more difficult to get all the way back to the past. The final part of the mix that makes this work is Sonic needing to travel at the correct speed for a set period of time. Because of this, it typically makes traveling through time an intentional thing. Either that, or it comes by accident if players lose control of Sonic's speed. So let's look at how changing these mechanics would change the game. If Sonic were to travel through time immediately when hitting the correct speed, that would mean that the Super Peel-Out would be a way to immediately travel to a new time period. While that could certainly be fun and cool, it takes away from any sort of challenge. It would potentially make it so traveling through time really is more of a gimmick to change the stage layout as the game currently is. I think if this had been the way time travel worked, the stage layouts would have had to have been vastly different to make time travel an interesting choice. Because once you can instantaneously travel through time to new versions of the stage, the time travel mechanic itself is less of a gameplay mechanic rather than the altering designs of the stages. This is the type of solution where I think you'd want to have various dead ends during different time periods, making it so Sonic would be absolutely required to travel to different times in order to progress through the stage. That way, time travel and exploration to progress would work hand in hand. Because traveling through time requires Sonic to pick up speed for that set period of time, it instead makes it so time travel itself is the interesting mechanic. Now, stages would need to be designed around the idea that certain areas would be difficult to travel through time, other areas impossible to travel through time, and other areas incredibly simple to travel through time. It makes it so players who are actively attempting to travel from one time period to another are on the lookout for where they can actually pick up speed for an uninterrupted period of time. If the developers want to give players a bone, they can use springs that bounce the players back and forth,
But in general, it makes it so the developers have a chance to make time travel much more tailored to when they want players to be able to time travel. It helps a bit with what I talked about in the last section, where being able to time travel at any point could potentially break the game if players were time traveling into walls. Now, the team can specifically create sections of the stages that block off players from being able to pick up enough speed to travel through time when they don't want the stage layout of the various time periods to permit it. What this now works interestingly with are the various signposts scattered throughout the stages. Again, to give an alternate way to do this, the team could have made it so players can only travel through time at the signposts and need to run through them at a specific speed. That would have limited the open feeling of Sonic CD and might have been the easier choice. With that choice, the team would have been able to make it so at certain points, Sonic has to cross into the future, then at certain points have to cross into the past, perhaps creating a more maze-like feeling to the exploration of Sonic CD. Players could have had a button that lets them designate which time period they want to go to at any given time once they have enough speed. But by making it so players have to find and cross a signpost, it's much more limiting to the time travel, but not necessarily in a negative way. It means that players will need to search and explore for the signpost that will take them to the time period they want to travel to, search and explore for the proper place to pick up speed, and during that entire time, make sure to avoid hitting the wrong signpost. Because if you want to travel to the past, but then accidentally hit a future signpost, you're now going to be traveling to the future if you pick up speed instead of the past. This makes playing Sonic CD, in some ways, a much more calculated affair than playing Sonic 1 or Sonic 2. In those games, you wanted to avoid enemies and obstacles, sure, but now, players will want to watch for signposts and even keep track of their speed. It might mean grabbing a past signpost and then searching for a place to safely use it without picking up enough speed to accidentally lose it. It also means hitting future signposts, either accidentally or on purpose, and then attempting to pick up just enough speed to the point where you can almost travel through time, then purposefully slowing down to lose it, or travel slowly and cautiously until you hit another past signpost. This is the type of gameplay that I feel, at least, Sonic CD invokes when you're trying to create a good future by destroying all of the robot generators in the past. A much more calculated affair where you're always on the lookout for certain obstacles and watching your speed. It makes it so time travel can definitely be about exploration, but it's not necessarily exploration for the sake of progressing through the stage, which is an interesting difference from a lot of games that utilize time travel as their gimmick. This is one of those things that some players will love and some players will hate. And to be fair, if you don't like it, it is a totally optional way to play Sonic CD. For my part, once I decided to play this way and attempt for a good ending with the robot transporters, this was when I truly started to have fun with Sonic CD. This feels, to me, like the way the game was intended to be played and designed to be played. And even if you're playing the game straight through without doing this, I feel like you can feel that design choice because, to my opinion, the game is far less interesting if you're playing it as a normal Sonic game. But that's going to take me neatly into the next section. The robot transporters. Outside of time travel, the other main gimmick of Sonic CD are these robot transporters that can be found in the past of Acts 1 and 2 of every zone. Players can find a clue as to where the robot transporter is by actually finding a no longer functioning one in the present, which will be in the same location as it can be found in the past. However, notably, neither good nor bad future has the robot transporter present, as I suppose it's just been too long by that point. The idea, to my mind, with the name of this, being that Robotnik traveled to the past of all of the zones and placed robot transporters where he could have his badniks transport through time to the past and take over a little planet from there, meaning that he'll rule the planet by the future. While players can beat the game normally without ever dealing with the past, present, or future, they'll get the bad ending where Little Planet reappears chained up as Sonic didn't save the future. If players travel to the past of an act and find and destroy the robot transporter, they'll then get a special ending to that act saying, Sonic made a good future. I want to put the time stones aside for a moment, because that's a pretty important discussion to have about Sonic CD and the good ending. The robot transporters are hidden somewhere in each act, which means that if players want the good ending, time stones aside, they'll need to travel to the past and explore until they find these machines and destroy them.
This is the piece that truly brings together the entire point of the past, present, and future in Sonic CD. Without this element, it really is just remixed versions of each stage. But because players need to travel to the past to find the robot transporter, it means that players who want to do this will need to be actively searching for past signposts and areas they can pick up enough speed to travel to the past, all while avoiding future signposts. It also means that, when in the past, players will need to avoid future signposts at all costs, as until they find the robot generator, players will be wanting to search everywhere for the robot transporters. As I've mentioned, finding and destroying the robot transporters feels like the intended way to play Sonic CD. There are regularly springs and walls that will destroy Sonic's momentum when running forwards, and kind of destroy that flow state that feels much more achievable in Sonic's 1 and 2. But these springs that almost feel like they're too present, all of a sudden make sense when you keep in mind that the point is to stop Sonic's momentum, is to make it harder to pick up momentum for long enough to travel through time. And that gameplay only really makes sense if you're playing for these robot transporters. When you're playing the game this way and exploring every nook and cranny, suddenly these springs are notable in their placement as ways to troll the player from moving to the past, or intentionally position next to future signposts as a very specific time travel obstacle. Or they feel like they're positioned to help players explore new platforms where the robot transporter just could be located. Searching for the robot transporters feels so much like the intended way to play Sonic CD, it makes some of the other choices around Sonic CD a little questionable. For example, the Japanese Sonic CD manual only has one brief mention of the robot transporters, as it seems like it's more of a secret. The US Sonic CD manual has no mention of the robot transporters. Completing an act in Sonic CD without destroying a robot transporter gives the standard "Sonic got through Act 1, congratulations" remark at the end, with no indicator there's another way to beat the stage. Then, there's the time stones Sonic can collect, which also gives players the good future and good ending for collecting all of them, making it completely irrelevant to go for the robot transporters. What this all results in is the robot transporters becoming more of a secret thing that only dedicated players will find and know about, and then eventually attempt to go for. And it's a bit of a baffling decision to me. I'm coming to you as someone who loves secrets in games, and someone who genuinely enjoyed playing Sonic CD by playing specifically going for robot transporters. I enjoyed it so much, it actually elevated my opinion of Sonic CD. Naoto Oshima wanted Sonic CD to be a game that was more about exploration. So why was the key to making exploration in Sonic CD work, these robot transporters, relegated to being more of an optional secret? Because here's the thing. The game could have been made so a stage couldn't have been cleared until Sonic found and destroyed the robot transporter. That would have forced players into playing the game this way, although, to be fair, it does make the gameplay a little more limiting and closes the option to simply speedrunning to the end, which is more of what Sonic had been about up to this point. I almost wonder if the robot transporters were made optional because the team wasn't 100% certain that players would like this gameplay shift, so they decided to play it safe and make it so it was only for dedicated Sonic players. Another option, and one that I'm leaning on the team should have done, was made it so Sonic is forced to travel to the past in Act 1 of Zone 1's Palmtree Panic, and then immediately stumbled upon a robot transporter. That way, players might destroy it on their own, or on a repeat playthrough, finish the act, and then see the dialogue, "Sonic made a good future." This could have been done by placing a past signpost right before the initial speed ramp players are forced to go up, and then they'd be time traveling by the time they finish the ramp. Or simply using one of the many spin-dash speed caves that we see throughout the game, but having a past sign right before it and at the beginning of the stage. That way, through gameplay, players would have discovered this optional way to beat a stage, and I think it could have made it more likely that players would think to be on the lookout for the robot transporters. To my opinion, attempting to destroy the robot generators feels like the intended way to play Sonic CD. It makes the game much more fun, it makes the stage design and time travel make far more sense, and yet, it's relegated to being an optional secret that isn't even necessary for the good ending. Without needing to travel to the past in order to destroy the robot transporters, traveling to the future doesn't make a difference. Yes, it's a slightly more challenging remix of the level, but honestly, it's not that much harder, If you're trying to simply beat a stage quickly, then you'll probably be avoiding signposts altogether. But if you're attempting to destroy the robot transporters, suddenly traveling to the future is a major punishment, with the point of the future being to find ways back to the past. The present then becomes a game of trying to explore and find the correct signpost and area to travel through time. The past then becomes a game of exploring to find and destroy a robot transporter, all while avoiding future signposts or picking up speed at the wrong place. So all in all, the robot transporters are what really brings the time travel mechanics together by creating a clear objective for players. But it is a shame that this is a completely optional feature to the game, in part thanks to the time stones. If players collect and hold on to 50 or more rings before the end of the stage, they'll be able to travel to a special stage similar to Sonic 1, succeed in 7 special stages, and players will collect all of the time stones, which automatically unlocks the good ending, regardless of how many robot transporters the player has destroyed. Not only that, but it actually removes robot transporters from all of the stages after the time stones are collected, which threw me off because I didn't know that at first, and searched endlessly in stages after collecting the time stones for the robot generators only to find nothing. Everyone's experience with Sonic CD is going to be different, and part of the reason I've been so critical of the optional nature of the robot transporters is related to my own experience. Remember, the internet barely existed when Sonic CD first came out in 1993, and I'm sure there weren't forums of people sharing information about secrets from the game. Meanwhile, I first played the game on Sonic Gems Collection in 2005. There, I played the game once, collected every time stone, achieved a good ending by doing this, and thought I was done with the game. I didn't even know that the robot transporters existed, nor did I think to look this up. And there wasn't much a reason for me to know. I beat the game with the good ending, I saved the world, I was good. The fact that the time stones unlock the good ending once again flies in the face of the idea of the robot transporters. On one hand, this gives players multiple ways to play Sonic CD. If you want to play the game normally without thinking, you can. If you want to play the game like Sonic 1, collect 50 rings and then beat all of the stages for a good ending, you can. If you want to explore and find robot generators to destroy for a good future, you can. So to the point of player choice, you could certainly view this as the best choice. It also creates the most replay value, as there's multiple ways to play Sonic CD. But there's a point where I think you might want to encourage players to play the game as designed, because if you can entirely skip destroying the robot generators to achieve a good ending, it makes that part of the design somewhat pointless, and something players will, intentionally or not, completely skip. Searching for the robot generators is time-consuming, so why do that when you can simply collect 50 rings and get the same result? And it's a shame, because so much of the gameplay of Sonic CD feels tailored around these robot transporters, but everything about the game feels like it's pulling players away from doing this, especially considering that collecting all of the time stones even removes the robot transporters from the stages they're in. Sonic CD feels like the most divisive Sonic game from when I look online, and while I could be mistaken, I think this is a lot of why. Feel free to correct me if I'm mistaken, but I think there are a lot of people, like me, who played the game through not knowing about the robot generators and were underwhelmed by Sonic CD. Then there's a group of players who played every nook and cranny of Sonic CD, love the exploration of the game, and find it to be the best Sonic game. And I'm guessing a lot of that was falling in love with the past, present, future tug and pull of the game by playing for the robot generators. And look, I'm sure there are also players who played for robot generators and found it uninteresting, and players who played the game normally and really enjoyed a more chill Sonic game, as Sonic CD is, to my opinion, the easiest of the classic Sonic games, especially when playing straight through. But I'm guessing, maybe wrongly, most players fall into those first two camps I established. Either way, I think it would have been nice if the time stones had been removed, at least in their functionality of giving the good ending. It feels, to me, like the team should have gone all in on the exploration version of Sonic CD and truly made this what the game was about. Because, as it stands, to my opinion, the game is sometimes at odds with itself. The game is oftentimes about attempting to travel through time at the right moments, or avoid traveling through time at the wrong moments, meaning a lot of springs, bumpers, and speed shafts that players will be avoiding or specifically playing with in order to achieve these things. But oftentimes, that design doesn't make much sense for the player who's simply trying to breeze through a stage. For players who do want to play the game like a normal Sonic game, the obstacles of the stage aren't set up in a way that's necessarily the most interesting or as specifically interesting for progressing forwards, as all of it is designed with the idea that players will be exploring through different time periods rather than progressing forwards in a linear manner. Destroying the robot generators can be fun, but traveling through a stage and collecting 50 rings makes it so that endeavor is technically pointless. And that's not to say players won't make their own fun or attempt to do both, but it is to say that those mechanics don't go hand in hand. I hope you don't take this as me over-critiquing Sonic CD. I'm a fan of the robot transporters and the design choices around them, and I'm simply wondering what other design choices could have been made to amplify those ideas rather than counter them. If you're someone who loves being able to play Sonic CD for robot transporters, and also loves playing the game just to speed through time attack style and see what time you can get, you're not wrong for liking both aspects to the game and enjoying there's two different ways to play. At the end of the day, that means all of these design choices resonated with you, whereas, to my personal taste, I would have liked to have seen the exploration factor really played up and highlighted, as that was the unique aspect to Sonic CD I liked the most. At the same time, there will be players who wish the game was more akin to Sonic's 1, 2, and 3 and want a more straightforward platforming adventure. So my critiques come from a place as to where I think the game could have been improved for myself. But that's not to take away from your opinion and experience around Sonic CD, positive or negative. This general critique actually leads itself into another new element to Sonic CD, and that's these metal Sonic holograms. Not only can players find robot transporters in the past to destroy and create a good future, but they can also find metal Sonic holograms to destroy in all of the zones outside of Metallic Madness. By destroying the hologram, it will make animals roam around freely in the past where they're found. It's a fun little bonus and Easter egg, and something for dedicated players to search for, but outside of that visual, there's no true gameplay purpose to it. It doesn't affect if players achieve a good or bad future, and to my understanding, it doesn't affect the ending. I saw a Reddit thread that claimed it would give additional sprite art in the good ending of the original game for destroying all of these, but I can't confirm that or find any other mention of this. So generally speaking, I think this is a fun, optional thing for players to find if they choose. It would have been more rewarding if it gave players something more for doing so, or to my mind, as someone who loves collecting things, something to collect for the effort. But there's nothing wrong with having an optional thing to search for with the mini bonus for doing so. But here's what I wonder about the Metal Sonic holograms. How many players choose to search for all of the holograms and destroy them? Because I would imagine the number of players who search for and destroy the optional robot transporters is going to be less than those who generally beat the game or go for time stones. And from there, I imagine even less players are going to attempt destroying the Metal Sonic holograms because they have no true reward for doing so, in that they don't alter if players get a good or bad ending. Now, this isn't a ding on the Metal Sonic holograms. As I mentioned, I think it's great to have a fun optional thing for players to do, and I'd rather have these here as they function than not have them at all. The reason I bring all of this up is that it further plays into the optional nature of exploring the past, present, and future, and how all of the exploratory gameplay elements of Sonic CD truly are optional. Think about Sonic 3. The gameplay reason you explore, meaning this is outside of making your own fun, is to find rings to special stages. The reason you want to explore and find special stages is to find Chaos Emeralds. The reason you want Chaos Emeralds is to eventually unlock Supersonic or Hypersonic. The reason you want this is not only being able to play as Supersonic/Hypersonic, but that it also adds gameplay to the ending by unlocking the additional stage of Doomsday Zone on top of the best ending. Again, outside of making your own fun, which is of course a viable thing, from a gameplay standpoint, why destroy the robot transporters? Well, maybe you want the best ending, but don't want to collect the time stones. Okay, why destroy the Metal Sonic holograms? Because you want the feeling of completing the game 100%. And all of that is fine. But this is where, again, Sonic CD would have benefited from making all of the exploration of the game play off in a bigger way, which would then further incentivize players to explore, which I know I'm sounding like a broken record, seems to be how Sonic CD was intended to be played. As it stands, Sonic CD is a very open-ended game to both its benefit and detriment. Players are open to play in any way they like, with exploration being a rewarding but optional side element to the game, and for some, that's the perfect balance. You can pop in Sonic CD and say, I feel like exploring, and then explore and get something out of it. You can pop in Sonic CD another day and say, I feel like running through the game and not worrying about exploration, and you can do this. But I'd argue, because the game tries to be so open, the game isn't truly designed around one aspect of gameplay, and that ends up hurting both exploration and playing straight through. Because the game seems designed with an emphasis on exploration, that automatically means challenges and stage layouts have to be different than they would be in a game with more straightforward gameplay. Whether that means giant walls or bumpers frequently blocking players from progression, as they're truly intended for that exploration side, or challenges being toned down, or specifically meant for the idea that players will be traveling back and forth a lot. As a brief example, you can't have the lava geyser of Marble Zone that chases players from Sonic 1, because it wouldn't work with the exploration of Sonic CD. Most of the truly challenging elements that were seen in Sonics 1 and 2 aren't present in Sonic CD, because they aren't conducive to exploration. But then, on the exploration side, because the game tries to have it both ways, none of the exploration is mandatory, and none of it makes a tangible gameplay difference. Exploration is never required, and it doesn't even matter for if players want the best ending of Sonic CD. And with all of that, you're going to get players who come away with completely different experiences and takeaways from Sonic CD, for better or worse. Now, to wrap all of this section up on a positive note, I really like the way time travel functions in Sonic CD, and how that affects the game's exploration. The choices made with signposts, and having Sonic travel to and maintain a certain speed in order to actually time travel, is incredibly unique, and leads to a wonderfully open sense of how Sonic can travel from one time period to another. It's fascinating to me how many obvious seeming ways to handle time travel the team avoided, because it led to this unique mechanic that I think is easy to overlook because it now exists in Sonic CD. The tug and pull of trying to avoid future signposts while heading to the past and trying to remain there is an interesting gameplay loop I don't think I've experienced in other platform games, and it leads to Sonic CD's best moments. The general gameplay of Sonic is fun, so exploring with Sonic is fun, and that makes exploring some of these stages a blast. So, with the general gameplay of Sonic CD covered, let's enter into Sonic CD's first stage, Palmtree Panic. I think it's interesting to look at the first moments of these stages and what they're trying to teach players. I talked pretty extensively about how Sonic 1's first moments taught players ramps, acceleration, jumping at angles, destroying boxes, enemies, and more, all in rapid succession in my Sonic 1 video. Sonic 2 seemed fairly similar in how it handled its opening moments, really playing off of players obtaining rings and then the danger immediately afterwards, potentially teaching players how the ring system works in Sonic. Sonic CD, on the other hand, has a much more relaxed opening section. The ground is rugged, just like in the other Sonic games, immediately showing off the game's acceleration, deceleration, and ramp system. There are immediately rings and a hill players can jump on, or rather jump through to land on, as it's a one-way platform. The only enemies we see in the opening sequence are these bugs who will fly straight down at the ground when Sonic is within their detection range, making for a much more simple enemy. This is a much more relaxed opening sequence than the previous two Sonic games, but in a way, that's actually pretty fitting for Sonic CD, as the game has a more relaxed pacing to it overall. The danger is much lower, and there aren't quick lessons taught in such rapid succession. For example, there's no monitor here for players to quickly get, and the enemies don't shoot projectiles or move particularly fast, making them easy for even beginners to avoid. As the major ramp here goes down, I'm not sure it teaches how jumping is affected by angles, which is an interesting and unique factor to Sonic, and was a lesson taught early and well in Sonic 1. None of this particularly bothers me, by the way. I think all of these lessons are eventually taught throughout the first stage. It's just interesting how much more relaxed the pace of teaching these elements are in Sonic CD. I think you could argue that in both Sonic 1 and 2, after the first few moments, pretty much everything the player needs to know has been taught outside of the spin dash in Sonic 2, whereas some of these more teachable moments are more so sprinkled throughout Palmtree Panic Act 1. The first major obstacle we get in Sonic CD is this fun 3D ramp. It seems like one of those things that was used to try and showcase the power of the Sega CD by having the camera spin, or at least tricking players into thinking the camera was spinning by clever maneuvering of the background elements. The funny thing is, I always thought this was one giant vertical ramp and didn't quite understand why there was a giant ramp at the start of this, but I've now come to realize that it's supposed to be one of the classic Sonic loops. The game attempts to pull off this trick utilizing the background, where players will see the background scroll vertically into the sky, and then come back around to showing the ground and water again, but now upside down. Because this is a very specific parallax scrolling effect, that's likely why players are blocked off from returning to this portion of the map after completing this, and also why players are locked into the loop once they start it without being able to back off. The other two elements that help sell the idea of the camera spinning are a combination of where the ground collider is on this ramp and the speed of the camera moving. If you notice, when you get close to the ramp, the camera movement speeds up, and Sonic will then run up the middle of the ramp instead of the side as he does in the other games. But technically, the ramp actually doesn't change at all, which is pretty amazing because I always thought that something changed to make it look like it was spinning from a 2D view into a 3D view. Because of the quick movement of the camera, combined with Sonic's sprite changing his angle, and the floating D-pad that does switch to a 3D perspective, it helps really sell this camera spin effect on the entire ramp. I will say, I never really understood the reason the D-pad is here, as it's not an in-world thing. I thought the idea was to show players to run forwards and help sell the idea of Sonic's momentum, which seemed like an odd choice to me as that's so obvious, and you'd think if there was a D-pad anywhere, it would be to show players how to do the more complex super peel-out or spin dash, but in thinking about it, I really think this is specifically here to sell the 3D camera move. To that end, there was probably something more in-universe the team could have gone with, I'd think. Outside of that critique, technically, the loop and ramp don't serve as anything other than a little fun wow moment for the game. But, as I've talked about in my other Sonic videos, I like that. I think it's a fun little gimmick, and even though you're not technically doing anything here, it's a cool set piece. Right after the loop, players will come to the first checkpoint, which is a nice touch. At this point, it's pretty notable how free you are to explore. The game is no longer go from point A to point B, but rather, because you launched off of this massive ramp, there are things behind you that the player would have missed. There are paths beneath you, paths straight ahead, and paths going up. It immediately sets the vibe of Sonic CD is about exploration, and this is all done in a non-verbal way through gameplay, simply by launching players into the middle of a stage section rather than starting at the classic left to right or right to left. If players take the upwards path, they'll be greeted by both a past and future sign right before a speed boosting spin dash ramp. This is another intentional teachable moment. The future sign is a little more avoidable, while the past sign, which is the one players should be going for, is directly in front of this sequence. Technically, players can avoid this by going above it, but for the most part, it is forced. This is exactly the sort of thing I talked about in my robot transporter sequence as to what I wanted to see from Sonic CD. It's almost there, and it's so close. This is a great teaching moment, but it's notable that players can actually go down this ramp and not transport through time even if they intended to. On top of that, players can technically skip this, which might be something the team did for the sake of players who wanted to beat these stages quickly, but it does mean some players might miss traveling through time here. The other part to my main critique from earlier is that the robot transporter is nowhere near this and is instead near the end of the stage, meaning players might never learn about the robot transporters. Robot transporters aside, as I think I've already talked about them enough outside of some placements we'll be talking about throughout the stages, this is a fantastic teaching moment for how time travel works. I actually don't even mind that players might miss traveling through time, as at the very least, sparks will fly off behind Sonic when traveling down the ramp, indicating something interesting was happening, and might make players think to try this again or try moving quickly after they hit another signpost. I think of the Sonic games as games that are, generally speaking, games that are meant to be replayed. A lot of enjoyment comes from learning and mastering the levels. So, to that end, players were introduced to the tool, shown at least a glimpse as to how to use it, and can use that knowledge moving forwards. Beyond the fact the game never outright teaches spin dashing or the super peel out, at this point, players should have all of the tools they need to move forwards. So, now that we're properly in Palmtree Panic, what is the overall structure and idea behind the stage? Well, everything here seems built with an emphasis on pushing exploration. There are rings players will regularly see just out of sight they'll have to figure out how to find, ground that will break beneath players revealing secret areas with goodies in them, hidden blocks players can accidentally jump on to reveal new paths, and even little Easter eggs, like this spot where players will end up speeding around behind the scenes only to burst out of a wall. Players will also sometimes see rings inside of walls, which is true of all of the stages in Sonic CD. I think the idea behind this is to act as additional encouragement for players to think to explore a different time period, where they'll then obtain those rings, once again pushing exploration. Unlike the prior games, which felt like they had very clearly defined routes for players to take, Palmtree Panic feels more like it has different routes that will split, then converge, then split and converge again. All of this together makes for a stage that, again, really pushes exploration. Honestly, beyond that, I'm not sure if I have any other notes for Palmtree Panic. It's a fine opening stage, and I think it does a good job exploring mechanics for players in a stage without too many frills, as that will come in later stages, and teaches what it needs to. If the players are in the present, they'll also come across the brand new character of Amy Rose near the end of the first stage. Technically, Amy's first appearance was in a manga series, but this is her first in-game appearance. Despite her minor screen time, Amy has a lot of personality thanks to her animations and frequent heart emojis and cutely jumping around as she sees Sonic. Something I actually didn't realize until playing recently, as I'd usually be in the past or future at this point and wouldn't run into Amy until Collision Chaos, is that if players slowly run away from her, she'll cling on to Sonic from behind, actually holding him in place with even more hearts bursting out of her. Even though her role is minor and she eventually serves as a damsel in distress, she's a fun and cute addition to Sonic, to my opinion. Naoto Oshima decided to make her more of a child who's in love with Sonic, with the feelings not being mutual, as he didn't think it fits Sonic's personality to have a love interest. So it does change up the dynamic in that way. It also makes it feel a bit less like a damsel in distress to me, as it's a child who's captured and needs saving. It's also pretty funny that Sonic has zero reaction to Amy, and if players let Amy cling on to him, he'll do his normal annoyed tapping his foot idle animation, really making it come across as him being annoyed with Amy. But he's a good guy and will still save her when she's eventually captured by Metal Sonic. Speaking on Easter eggs, there's another pretty funny one the team decided to add in. One I didn't even know until reading an interview with planner Kenichi Ono, translated by Shmuplations, was that, as he puts it, if you don't touch the controller for 3 minutes, Sonic will get bored and jump off the screen. We added a lot of little touches like that, which I'm excited for players to see. So I of course tested this, and found it pretty humorous that not only does Sonic jump off of the screen, but the players get a game over. I'm not sure if that was overkill, as there's always the chance someone would have left the game for a moment without pausing, which you can do to prevent this, only to come back to the TV a few minutes later shocked to find they received a game over and have no idea why. While this is a fun little touch, I will say that it's the type of attention to detail and additional animation that makes it especially baffling to me the spin dash charge up in Sonic CD doesn't use the new animation from Sonic 2, or at least something similar. As I mentioned earlier in the video, if players complete an act with 50 rings, they can jump into a ring, a la Sonic 1, in order to enter a special stage. And now that we're actually progressing through the game, now's the perfect time to talk about Sonic CD's special stages. The special stages here take full advantage of the brand new Mode 7 capabilities of the Sega CD to create something I'm fairly certain wasn't possible on the original Sega Genesis hardware. The idea is that Sonic is constantly running through a map with the camera directly behind him as players attempt to destroy UFOs within a specific time limit. Sonic's capabilities are limited to turning and jumping, and holding back to slow down a little bit, so it's a fairly basic minigame that, like the special stages of Sonic's 1 and 2, really seem partially meant as graphical showcases. To further complicate the minigame, if Sonic goes out of bounds or on the water within the bounds, time will drain from the remaining time. There are also power-ups players can find within the UFOs, including, most importantly, a time bonus, and occasionally, there are obstacles on the ground with the walls acting as bumpers. In a way, this is the most fair special stage we've seen so far between Sonics 1, 2, and CD. You can see the objectives in front of you, and you have full control over Sonic. Although, I will say, a common complaint I've seen over Sonic CD's special stages is that some people find it hard to gauge the depth of Sonic jumping into the UFO he intends to hit. This isn't a problem I've personally had, but I do want to point that out, and that's something that would make it feel more unfair. All of the UFOs move in a specific pattern to make hitting them more difficult, and I think this is where I tend to run into my own personal issues with the Sonic CD special stages. The UFO movements can feel erratic, even though I know they're moving in a pattern, and I'll frequently find myself just missing one only to waste time trying to turn around and make it back to one again. So, for me, it's honestly a special stage that ends up oftentimes being more frustrating than fun, and I don't think I'm even particularly bad at these. I might fail at one occasionally, but anytime I've played Sonic CD with the intention of collecting all of the time stones, I've never not been able to, which is definitely something I like over Sonic 1. Everyone ranks the special stages of the Sonic games completely different based on their tastes, and I can see the appeal of this one due to the fact that your entire goal is right in front of you. There aren't hidden rings or bombs with poor draw distance that might screw you over, like in Sonic 2, and there isn't wacky physics with a lot of blind falling like in Sonic 1. Sonic CD's special stage is a middle-of-the-road one for me. I definitely prefer Sonic CD's special stages over Sonic 1's, by a wide margin, but, and maybe this is controversial, I enjoy the simple ring collection of Sonic 2 a little more. Although, to be fair, I grew up with Sonic 2 and not Sonic CD, so this could be in part because I can probably play those special stages better due to muscle memory and general strategy memorization. Because players have only one chance to access special stages at the end of an act, that does make failing at a special stage in Sonic CD a little more frustrating than failing in Sonic 2. In Sonic 2, there were 62 checkpoints, which is how players access special stages, meaning players had 62 attempts at getting all 7 Chaos Emeralds. Sonic 1 has 10 acts that can lead to a special stage, meaning 10 potential attempts at all 6 Chaos Emeralds. Meanwhile, Sonic CD has 14 acts that can lead to a special stage, giving players 14 opportunities to obtain its 7 time stones, making it less forgiving than Sonic 2, but overall more forgiving than Sonic 1. For beating a special stage, players will obtain a time stone, with the goal being to collect all 7 in order to create a good future in every stage and automatically get the good ending. There's not much else to it other than what I discussed earlier and how this plays against the exploration factor of Sonic CD, but does present an alternate way to get the good ending. Finish Palmtree Panic, and players will reach the first boss of Sonic CD, Egg-HVC-001, which is a name I honestly had to look up. In a way, this is one of the more traditional bosses of Sonic CD, with Robotnik moving back and forth in a machine with bumpers for arms and spikes for legs. What this then asks of players is to time out when they can find an opening to hit Robotnik due to him raising and lowering his bumpers. Each hit will destroy an arm, and then finally the machine itself. Players can also jump over the bumpers and avoid some of this, or even stand behind him, especially thanks to the invincibility that can be found earlier in Act 3, and wail on him from behind for a quick victory. Something fun is that if players have a bad future or good future, it will affect the aesthetics of this fight, but notably for this fight, specifically, nothing else. This is an incredibly simple fight that really seems meant to teach players timing and patience. Of the opening boss battles we've seen thus far, Sonic 1's Egg Wrecker is probably the most interesting and asks the most of players. But ultimately, as this is a Stage 1 boss, I think it's okay to test the player on simple things. Sonic isn't a game about fighting or battles, so I also don't necessarily expect a major boss test from the game. As we'll see in future bosses from Sonic CD seems to take note of this factor more so than the other Sonic games, and typically uses its boss battles as further platforming challenges rather than the fight itself, which actually makes the Egg HVC001 stand out even further. For defeating the Egg HVC001, players will find themselves in Collision Chaos. While Sonic is already on Little Planet to save the planet from Robotnik, a new objective comes in the form of Metal Sonic abducting Amy at the start of Act 1, now giving players an additional incentive to go forth and save her. This is also the introduction to Metal Sonic, who is cool as hell, but we'll come back to him. Collision Chaos, as the name implies, is Sonic CD's pinball stage. Sonic 1 had Spring Yard Zone, Sonic 2 had Casino Night Zone, and now Sonic CD has Collision Chaos. Collision Chaos definitely feels more inspired by Spring Yard Zone and like a leveled up version of that stage, rather than taking inspiration from Casino Night Zone, which, makes sense as Sonic 2 and CD were, at times, in development at the same time. Even more than Casino Night Zone, this stage feels to me like the team saying, yes, we did Spring Yard Zone, but give us another chance and we can do it better. Where you can see the onus of the idea of springs littered throughout Spring Yard Zone, they are truly everywhere in Collision Chaos, as well as several bumpers sprinkled throughout to make for a chaotic playthrough. On top of that, Sonic 1 had this fun idea of half pipes players could use to make it through certain obstacles. So, in Collision Chaos, we see that idea also ramped up, with half pipes allowing Sonic to achieve massive heights and even helping out with time travel. As Collision Chaos focuses so much on springs, bouncing, and giant ramps, with occasional pinball flippers, actual runways for speed are pretty limited, so instead, the team seemed to focus on finding alternate ways to travel through time rather than only in traveling horizontally. This might be utilizing springs to bounce back and forth while running over ceilings, going through spin dash ramps, connecting springs with ramps, or using the giant half pipes I mentioned. It feels like in designing this stage, the team was actively seeking out how they could break the conventional way to time travel by running forwards in interesting ways, and I think the stage succeeds. While there are plenty of bumpers and springs throughout the stage, creating its chaotic environment, it never feels as out of control as moments from, say, Sonic 2's Casino Night Zone. At the same time, the level is far more focused than what it's doing than Sonic 1's Spring Yard Zone, with this clear direction. To its detriment or benefit, depending on what type of player you are and your preferences, this is also a far easier stage than Spring Yard Zone. There are mantises who throw their bladed arms, but for the most part, this stage is a walk in the park, and that's not a good or bad thing, it just comes down to your tastes. I think a lot of that, in Collision Chaos, does come down to the fact that this stage is clearly designed for being able to bounce around and explore every nook and cranny without ever getting trapped into a certain path, as the stage is more focused on exploration. Its springs and bumpers oftentimes serve less as obstacles, and more as ways to try to get to a new and different path you hadn't seen before, just in case that's where the robot transporter of the stage might be, or that past signpost you need. Another fun element to Collision Chaos are these giant rotating pipes with platforms on them that serve as an interesting platform obstacle. This is what I mean when I say the game is more about exploration. This obstacle is completely optional to find, and for failing at it, you simply fall down and can easily travel back up. There's no need to do the obstacle, and there's no failure state for messing up. Because ultimately, it's just there as another element for players to explore, when in another Sonic game, this probably would have been a mandatory obstacle, as it's actually an interesting challenge. Overall, this is a stage I really enjoyed. The bumpers and springs were fun to play around with, but never overused to the point where I personally became annoyed with them. On top of that, the physics of Sonic moving on ramps is in full display here, and those parts, in particular, are a blast to play around with. Before moving on to the boss of Collision Chaos, I do want to now bring up an element I skipped over when talking about the basic mechanics, and that's time limits and checkpoints. These elements are nothing new to Sonic, which is part of why I wanted to talk about them a little later, and have a chance to talk about some stage design and overall gameplay design first, as all of this changes how these elements play out in Sonic CD. In the prior Sonic games, the time limit was always there, but never particularly that important. Players had 10 minutes to complete a stage, which was usually ample time unless you were really exploring every nook and cranny or trying to get every last ring to get every Chaos Emerald in one of the stages of Sonic 2. But if you notice, the thing in those stages that did make the time limit a potential thing to worry about was if you were exploring. Now, enter Sonic CD, where if you're attempting to go for robot transporters, the entire game is about exploration, and yet there's a 10-minute time limit. This isn't an issue when you're playing the game straight through. After all, these stages are some of the quickest and easiest to finish in any of the classic Sonic games. But when you're searching for one thing in a massive stage where you have to make sure you travel to the past and never accidentally go to the future, suddenly, the game's length grows exponentially and the time limit becomes a major factor. And here's the other thing that's worth noting. If you hit a checkpoint, that checkpoint will remember the time you had when you hit it, and if you die, you'll still have the same amount of time left when you use your life and return to a checkpoint. That's not an issue I ran into in Collision Chaos, but it was an issue I ran into my first time looking for robot transporters in Wacky Workbench. But before getting to that, I do question if having a time limit really makes sense as a gameplay mechanic in Sonic CD, very specifically. It made sense in the previous games, because those games were about going fast and seeing how quickly you could eventually complete a stage through mastering them. And Sonic CD actually has a time attack mode that's built for this exact thing. But in the normal game, if you're meant to explore, a time limit kind of flies in the face of that. The game isn't about speed at that point, it's about exploration. So this comes across as another mechanic that feels like it's somewhat counter to the exploration intent of Sonic CD. You can obviously create your own little mini game of seeing how fast you can both destroy a robot transporter and then finish a stage, and you have the timer right there. Additionally, to be fair, I think 10 minutes is typically ample time to explore most of these stages for the robot transporter. But why have an arbitrary time limit to do so? And if you're looking for the Metal Sonic holograms on top of the robot transporters, again, you're now much more limited on how much time you have to find them. It also leads to potential problems like what I ran into at Wacky Workbench with the way the checkpoints work by saving your current time. In Wacky Workbench, my first time looking for robot transporters, I got stuck in the future for quite some time and then had trouble finding a clear way back to the past. I accidentally hit a checkpoint at 9 minutes and 33 seconds, meaning I only had 30 seconds left. And the game saved that when I ran out of time and died, returning to the checkpoint with 9 minutes and 33 seconds. I eventually managed to transport into the future and died from running out of time there. And now, because I had no checkpoints in the future, I started at the beginning of the stage in the future, but with a time of 0. So what was the point of the checkpoint time punishment if traveling through time and dying there would reset my time to 0? On top of that, I can see a situation where a player hits a checkpoint without having enough time to finish the stage or travel through time, forcing them into using all of their lives for what seems like a minor mistake, overblowing the punishment. All of this makes it seem, to me, like the checkpoint system is completely flawed in saving how much time is left, because dying in the past or future resets the time anyways. And again, this is for a mechanic that isn't particularly conducive towards exploration anyways. Another interesting choice with the checkpoints is that they're only in the present. There are no checkpoints in the past or future, and I don't think I fully understand this choice. If you die in the past or future, it's back to the start of the stage in that time period. If you die in the present, it's back to whatever checkpoint you were at. So why the difference? Why not have no checkpoints in any of the stages, or checkpoints in both the past and future? Was it to make the past and future feel a little more dangerous for progression? Was it to emphasize exploration in those time periods? This system of having checkpoints only in the present isn't something that particularly bothers me, but look, as I'm analyzing so much of this game, it's worth bringing up how it does seem like an odd and inconsistent choice. The time limit itself, though, feels more unnecessary to me in Sonic CD than the other games. You can keep the timer itself, but just have it keep running past 10 minutes or stop at 9 minutes and 59 seconds as the lowest score. That still gives speedrunners something to shoot for, but makes it so this mechanic doesn't run counter to the exploration factor of Sonic CD. For making it through bumpers and pinball galore, players will come to Robotnik as the Egg Tilter. The Egg Tilter is particularly notable as this is the first true boss deviation in Sonic CD. Whereas the prior games had much more traditional boss encounters, with Robotnik attacking Sonic in some sort of machine, and Sonic destroying that machine variation, here, the boss fight is really a mini pinball sequence. If players make it to the top of the pinball sequence, they'll automatically win and be able to destroy Robotnik with no further challenge. So, rather than challenging you in a traditional boss fight, this is meant to be more so a test of the mechanics from the stage. You'll be pinballing your way up, all while avoiding or dealing with bumpers and trying to avoid getting hurt in the gutter. Another interesting aspect to this fight is that the Bad Future version of the battle is actually slightly more difficult than the Good Future version, with more of these bubble bumpers placed to block the player's path, and the bubbles themselves placed even more so in the player's path. I'm not sure what the general consensus on the Egg Tilter boss is, but I did watch a video by Met L titled I Was Wrong About Sonic CD, where he complains very specifically about this boss fight. I've also seen some commenters on forums complain that the boss fights of Sonic CD feel anticlimactic. For my part, I actually like the concept of this, and I think it's cool that the game tries to do something different with its boss fights than traditional battles, and play more off of what the actual stage was about, rather than having a mandatory fight. I've mentioned throughout my Sonics 1 and 2 videos that Sonic games are never about enemies or battles, and the enemies are really just moving and destructible obstacles rather than being true individual challenges. So, in a way, the boss fights, while fine, are a little out of place from the gameplay of the rest of the game, as suddenly fighting an enemy with a genuine moveset is so far removed from anything players would be doing in the actual stages. So, I think this is a really cool idea, and I like that the team was thinking outside of the box for how its boss fights should be handled. Maybe it's because I pretty rarely struggle with this pinball sequence, but I enjoy it for what it is. Defeat the Egg Tilter, and it's onwards to Tidal Tempest. Tidal Tempest, as the name implies, is the water stage of Sonic CD, and it's interesting, to me, to look at the direction Sonic CD takes with its water stage compared to that of Sonic 2. To start though, Sonic 1's Labyrinth stage mostly took place underwater, with timing challenges as players would rush from one bubble of air to another in order to not drown, all while dealing with the slower pacing of the water. Sonic 2 then had Aquatic Ruin Zone, with the idea instead being about staying out of the water. The water is dangerous, so try to stay on the upper paths, where most of the danger involves players dropping to lower paths where they'll have to deal with the more difficult water area. With CD, Tidal Tempest takes players in and out of the water, kind of more akin to Sonic 1. There are stretches where players can avoid falling into the water at the top of the stage, somewhat more like Sonic 2, and unlike Sonic 1, the getting out of the water typically isn't too difficult, as there's frequent areas and springs for bouncing out. Because, once again, this stage is truly centered around exploration. And I think this stage, compared to Aquatic Ruin Zone, is a great way to view the branching team's ideologies for the design of Sonic and how to evolve a stage like a Labyrinth Zone. As the water ended up being more punishing, and to my view, not as much fun to play in as a normal stage, Sonic 2's team made the water a hazard in a horizontal action-based platform stage. It's a keep away from the hazard mechanic now. Whereas Sonic CD's team, instead, uses the water as a dangerous zone for exploration. There are multiple water pockets, with the true nature of these coming into play when searching for ways or places to travel through time, or searching for robot generators or metal Sonic holograms. It's easy to avoid these pockets or get out of them if you're completing the stage normally, but the idea with these is that you'll want to explore each pocket thoroughly, get some air, then move on to exploring the next water pocket. Most of the dangerous hazards of Sonic 1 are removed, because that's not the point of this, and that would make exploration more frustrating. As someone who is never a fan of Labyrinth Zone from Sonic 1, I think both Sonic 2's Aquatic Ruin Zone and Sonic CD's Tidal Tempest are much more interesting and fun takes on how to handle water hazards. Sonic CD's version makes for a much more relaxed experience, where there is the occasional danger from drowning, which plays into Sonic's gotta go fast factor, but that's the only true hazard here. On top of that, something interesting about the mechanic is that the panic-inducing Sonic drowning music doesn't play in Sonic CD, and there's just the countdown timer. That could be a licensing thing, because the Japanese and North American soundtracks were by a different composer from Sonic 1 and 2, which were composed by Masato Nakamura, but Sega probably still had the rights to it, as it does play in Sonic 3. On top of that, there's no music change at all to indicate danger, which is another decision that helps make this stage feel more chill. So, perhaps they had the option to use the drowning music and actually chose against it, as it would play against that relaxed pacing of Tidal Tempest. To my personal tastes, I prefer the direction of Aquatic Ruin Zone, but I'd still rather play through Tidal Tempest than Labyrinth Zone. But I do wonder, which direction for Water Stage do you prefer, and which did you enjoy more? For making it through the watery depths of Tidal Tempest, players will reach Robotnik in his egg bubble. This is a two-parter boss fight, with the first one being a chase through a vertically looping labyrinth. After players hit Robotnik enough times, he'll escape away into the water and encircle himself with bubbles. The bubbles both protect him and serve as a source of air for Sonic, so in order to chip away at Robotnik's defense, players are also getting the air they need in order to stay in the water, which is a pretty interesting way to have a boss fight that is entirely underwater. Robotnik will either travel across the top of the screen and shoot 4 easy-to-read and avoid energy balls, or swoop towards the player, also shooting these energy balls. And that's pretty much it. I'm a little mixed on how I feel about this fight, though. The first portion, where Sonic is chasing Robotnik through a labyrinth, feels entirely pointless. There's absolutely no danger here. It's a bit like reversing the Robotnik boss battle from Labyrinth Zone, where players were chasing him up through a series of obstacles as water rose from below. But, whereas that had this interesting series of obstacles that played off of the stage, the water doesn't even come into play during this portion of Egg Bubble, and there's no hazards at all, so it almost ends up feeling like filler to me. The second half of the fight is interesting enough with bubbles and beam shooting, and I definitely appreciate the team attempting to do something different to try and create an entirely underwater fight. But the resulting battle ends up really being no different if Robotnik just has some normal shields around him on land. There are so many bubbles, it's not like players are actually in danger of drowning. So this feels more like a surface concept than a truly interesting solution. I think if maybe there was a section players had to hit to create a few temporary bubbles they'd have to try and get, and another section for players to truly hurt Robotnik, that would create a more interesting tug and pull than this. Defeat the egg bubble, and players will reach Quartz Quadrant. The main conceits here are both that it's a much more horizontal stage than anything else in Sonic CD, as well as these conveyor belts that will change directions based on a lever players can toggle. Unless you're trying to time travel, the direction the conveyor belt is going really doesn't mean anything. It's easy enough to run against the grain, and there aren't really any true obstacles playing against this to make this mechanic more interesting. Think about Sonic 1's Scrap Brain Zone, where conveyor belts might have smashers or spiked balls players would have to deal with. Sonic CD has, well, nothing to make the conveyor belt more interesting. So it really does just seem like something where, if you're running against the grain instead of with it, that might mess up your chances to time travel. Again, me being a broken record here, this is another example of how Sonic CD's stages are really built around the idea of exploration and time travel. Beyond the horizontal sections, there are a few massive rooms with springs, which help break up the different paths of the stage, and create a different sort of way to progress. As they're so light on platforms, it really is about letting the springs guide you to the top if you choose to go there. Quartz Quadrant is an interesting one to me, because it's a bit like the Starlight Zone of Sonic CD, in that Sonic 1 stages get progressively more difficult until Starlight Zone, which is a nice simple stage to catch your breath before the far more challenging Scrap Brain Zone. In terms of complexity, we went from the introductory stage of Palmtree Panic straight into the bouncing madness of Collision Chaos, then into the dangers of a water stage with Tidal Tempest, before this really straightforward run in a straight line stage of Quartz Quadrant. Like Starlight Zone,
On paper, if you're going from easiest to hardest, I think it would be easy to say Quartz Quadrant should be the second stage of Sonic CD. But, like Starlight Zone, I'm going to stick up for the level placement here as something that's a nice break of pace and helps ease players with something a little lighter before the far more complex stages to come. I will say though, while I don't consider Quartz Quadrant to be a particularly dangerous stage, I think traveling to the past can be a little tricky thanks to the conveyors and things like hidden springs that might ruin Sonic's speed. So in a straightforward level sense, Quartz Quadrant is, to my opinion, one of the easiest stages. In terms of traveling to the past, this actually might be the most challenging stage so far. Before moving on to the egg conveyor, let's stop and talk about the incredibly subjective topics of art and music. I'm going to start with the art of Sonic CD. I might be coming away here with a pretty controversial takeaway, but in some ways, I think Sonic CD has some of the best art of the original Sonic games, and in others, I think it has some of the worst art of the original Sonic games. To start with my positives though, I think the character designs here are absolutely fantastic. The Sonic we get in the opening and ending cutscenes, to this day, is one of my favorite visual versions of Sonic, and I think that's a pretty widespread sentiment. While I love Naoto Oshima's original concept, this version is just so cool. Additionally, I think Amy Rose is charming with a lot of personality, and Metal Sonic is wildly cool. While the similar idea of Mecha Sonic in Sonic 2 was a fun idea, from a visual standpoint alone, Metal Sonic is the one that truly stands out with his jet engine body. Robotnik is another interesting one, because something about the way the character model was made for Sonic CD makes him look less cartoony than the Sega Genesis counterpart, and, to my mind, all the more menacing for it. It's funny because some of the sprites look the exact same as the Sega Genesis iteration, outside of maybe his mustache having more shading on it, but there's this one brand new 3/4 angle they use for him from time to time that isn't in any of the other classic Sonic games, where he looks so much more evil and menacing. It might in part be because now he has an ear, so it makes him look more realistic, or it could be because his eyes are smaller and you can better see his goggles on top of the whites of his eyes. And then there's the final Robotnik fight, where there's this specific shading on him that helps make him look far more evil. So all of this is something I enjoy. But where I'm going to draw my criticisms is going to be in the tile sets and backgrounds. I talked about this a bit in my Sonic 2 video, but I think Sonic 2's background and tile set art was a great graduation from Sonic 1, whereas Sonic CD seems to be trying to copy the art style of Sonic 1, but in a way that's not particularly appealing to me. One of the most iconic stages in all of Sonic is Green Hill Zone, and part of what makes the art iconic is this geometric shaped pattern in the grounds tile set that makes it totally unique. Those shapes were somewhat present throughout Sonic 1 stages, but Sonic 2 then mostly dropped this in favor of more complex tile sets that I think ends up being more visually appealing, as they don't come across as repeating video gamey patterns. Sonic CD then takes that idea of repeating geometric shapes and then dials it up to 1000. Outside of Metallic Madness and Stardust Speedway, they are everywhere, and sometimes I think the patterns clash, like in Quartz Quadrant, where there's non-stop shapes everywhere. Another broader issue I have is in the backgrounds. Sonic 2 does a fantastic job at creating a sense of depth in its backgrounds. From changing the size of the things that are further back to using darker shading, all of this helps sell that illusion. Take this screenshot from Collision Chaos. Which series of trees in the front of the background is further back? I know the ones at the top are supposed to be, but the illusion doesn't really sell to me, and it blends with looking like these are simply taller trees, rather than creating a true sense of depth. And why is the top of Collision Chaos, only truly up at the top of the map, an upside-down version of the backgrounds? Are you supposed to be in a tube? That's not to say there are no backgrounds I like, and I don't appreciate any of the handiwork that went into this. I love the Greek architecture with the reflecting water at the bottom of Stardust Speedway. The shining lights of Stardust Speedway's present are very pretty. The tops of the red canyons of Wacky Workbench's past looks nice. I like the waterfalls of Palmtree Panic. The cave background of Tidal Tempest in the past looks cool. And I like the idea of this swampy background for Quartz Quadrant in the past.
I think part of what might be causing my issues with Sonic CD's backgrounds has to do with the vertical parallax scrolling. I could be mistaken, but I think the vertical parallax scrolling of Sonic CD is larger than that of Sonic 1 or 2, meaning that the team had to create a much larger, vertically, background. And because they created so many more elements that were stacked on top of each other for this vertical parallax scrolling, it made it harder for the team to make the background feel like it had depth, because there were too many layers, and those layers were all too large vertically. Let's go back to that swamp idea I liked from Quartz Quadrant's past. When you're down low, you're looking at the tops of trees, but past that, at the bottom, your entire view is water rising above you. So you're equally high enough to be above trees that are straight behind you, but then you somehow have this wide downwards view of water. You can eventually fly above this and it looks nice at the top, but there are portions like that where the perspective feels off. Anyways, I don't want to harp on this too much. There are 4 distinct versions of each stage depending on which time period you're in, and if it's a good or bad future, so the team had an absolutely insane amount of work. From an art standpoint, they were basically making 4 levels for the price of 1, so I can understand just how much work that is. But I do think there's something about the general art direction here that isn't clicking with me. Although, hey, if it does with you, again, that's why this is subjective. Moving on, let's talk about music. Sonic CD is interesting in that it's the only classic Sonic game with a mostly different soundtrack for the Japanese audience and the North American audience. Each time period here, and both the good future and bad future, also have their own individual music tracks. And what's interesting here is that, for some reason, the past version of each stage has the same music in both regions, while the present, bad future, good future, and even things like the boss battles are unique to the region. Which soundtrack is better feels like one of those classic battles in the Sonic community. Granted, I think most people tend to prefer the Japanese one. Whichever soundtrack you listen to though, Sonic CD's music is a major deviation from that of Sonic's 1 and 2, as it's the first game to not use composer Masato Nakamura. On top of that, stylistically, the music deviates heavily in the Japanese version as being more house. From an interview with composer Naofumi Hataya, translated by Shmuplations, our flash of inspiration came from the unique way Sonic was being handled by people in the UK. At clubs, DJs were using images of Sonic for their turntable slip mats, and stylish, fashionable magazines were using Sonic for their front covers. It was the early 90s, when club music was just beginning to infiltrate the Japanese music scene. The music felt very welcoming and familiar to those of us who had spent time making music on computers. With their extensive use of sampling, techno and house music seems to be brimming with new possibilities. And so, Ogata and I decided that Sonic CD would feature techno and house. I honestly don't think I have the same passion for either of these soundtracks as I do the Genesis games, which, to be fair, could simply be because I grew up with the Genesis games. But I feel like outside of the past versions of many of these stages, for the most part, they don't feel like the environment they're in to me, and I think that's part of what I love about some of the Sonic music and game music in general, is that I like the environment the music invokes to me. But that's obviously subjective to me, and I do think both soundtracks have some great songs, and it's hard for me to say there's one particular soundtrack I prefer over the other. Like, Sonic Boom is an absolute banger, and I don't know how anyone could argue the Japanese opening song is better than that. The present NA Wacky Workbench theme is a fun, goofy song that fits in with the weirdness of the area, and the present NA Stardust Speedway theme is fantastic, and I won't hear anyone telling me otherwise. But then, the Japanese soundtrack has the superior Collision Chaos, Quartz Quadrant, and Tidal Tempest to my taste. Plus, the boss theme of the Japanese soundtrack, definitely more fun than the boss theme of the NA soundtrack. I guess this is all to say, for me, I don't think one soundtrack is the definitive one. I can pick and choose tracks from both versions to create my ideal Sonic CD soundtrack, and I think that's probably true for most people. For making it through the runway of Quartz Quadrant, players will reach Robotnik in the Egg Conveyor. This is another boss fight that plays with the concepts from the stage, with Robotnik hiding away behind a blast shield of some sorts that just happens to be on a conveyor belt, like from the stage. The conveyor belt leads to a bed of spikes, meaning players will need to keep on running forwards if they want to avoid this. However, every so often, a magnet will bring over a spiked ball that will drop over the player's location, with the ball breaking into a mini AoE of spiked balls when it hits the ground. In an interesting twist, the way to hurt Robotnik here is simply by running, with the conveyor belt moving so quickly with Sonic running on it that the friction it creates slowly destroys the flooring of the machine he's standing on. It's not the most challenging fight, as you're just running forwards and occasionally pausing to avoid the magnetic ball drop, but this is quite possibly the most creative fight in the game. It's a fun play on how Sonic's speed and running could defeat Robotnik, and I love just how clever this idea of the conveyor belt friction is. While the challenge is minor, it does fit in with the overall idea of Sonic CD, in Sonic needing to control his speed and when players will need to run fast versus slowing down for a moment. One more thing I want to mention, this fight is a little easier in the good future with a protruding wall that goes over the spikes. This makes it so players have a safety zone when they try to jump away, rather than jumping into the spikes like in the bad future. Destroy the egg conveyor, and players will reach Wacky Workbench. And oh, what a stage! I think overall, this is a less popular one, with many people citing this as one of the reasons they don't like Sonic CD as much as the other games. Although, I will say, I've also seen people list this as their favorite stage in the game thanks to its totally unique mechanic. Wacky Workbench has two main mechanics at play. The first and most immediately noticeable is its "the floor is lava" variation of gameplay, where touching most sections of the ground level will, on a timer, skyrocket Sonic into the air. The second mechanic are these wires in the background that, on a timer, will flash and then zap Sonic if he happens to touch them when the electricity is going off. Most of the first act is designed so players will only be able to progress through the level at the bottom of the stage, near the ground. And in a reversal from the usual game trope, traveling to the top of the stage typically leads to dead ends, meaning players will often skyrocket from the ground into a dead end and need to work their way back down in order to properly progress. The second act is a little more simple, with these spinners in the air that players will attach to and circle around, launching off when they choose. While there are sections where players will need to work their way down from the ceiling, there's far less traps up above. While traveling to the past or future is fairly simple in the second act, thanks to these spinner tracks players can use to automatically time travel, finding locations to properly time travel in the first act can be especially tricky because there's no true ground path to run on, so it's a matter of finding a future or past signpost and then bringing that with them to an automated sequence that will shoot players forwards and into the desired time period. Accidentally traveling to the future, especially in Act 1, can feel like a true punishment in Wacky Workbench, in particular, as it can be so tedious to both find past signposts and find a place where you can actually use the signpost to travel through time. One area where Wacky Workbench could have pretty easily failed, as Sonic will be constantly falling in this stage, is that blind fall aspect to most platform games. At times, you'll be falling at pretty major speeds, making it practically impossible to react to what's below you. So, fortunately, the team saw this potential weakness in their design and placed a plethora of floating, bouncing, and moving platforms the players can fall onto, making the falling much more fair. Like Tidal Tempest before, if you look at the stage from the perspective of searching for all of the robot transporters to destroy, the stage becomes one about flying up into the various pockets, traveling to the top where a dead end is, and then exploring the next trap pocket. It's an interesting idea, although marred by an incredibly odd choice for a robot transporter location. There are these smashing pistons that don't really appear any different from the smashing pistons of any other stage or Sonic game. But, as it turns out, getting smashed by these doesn't crush the player, but instead sends them down a secret route to a new area, with one of these routes being the only way to reach Wacky Workbench Act 1's robot transporter. I got lucky in that I accidentally got crushed by one of these and realized they were transporters, but that was just a happenstance. This is the sort of secret I think is really cool in concept, but probably should have been relegated to a secret for 1-ups or something like that, rather than the somewhat mandatory robot transporter. I mean, mandatory in my mind in a world with no time stones. There's no reason a player should ever think to get crushed by one of these, and there's no indicator that there's a reason to. So I think if the team wanted this feature, which is fine, it needed to either have a better visual indicator, like some transparency within the piston and tube beneath, or a mandatory piston for progressing at the start of the stage that would teach players this idea. If, and this is an if, this was purely in the realm of finding secrets, I have no problem with it the way that it is. But for finding a robot transporter, it's probably a bit too obscure. Beyond that though, I don't have the same hiccups with this stage that I've seen many other people have. If you want to progress through the stage without worrying about the insane bouncing, it's easy enough with a little patience to just hop across the platforms. If the visual below was an instant death pit, players would naturally play that way, so I have to imagine that perhaps people get a little lazy with their platforming because the ground is technically safe. The reversal of tropes with flying up top and needing to work your way down is a cool concept. And while yes, it can get annoying, and trust me, there were times I'd bounce up to a trap section and get incredibly frustrated, it also made it memorable for me. I liked the challenge, and once I truly understood the concept, I enjoyed just how creative it was. Now, as I said, even though I ended up liking this, I did have moments of pure annoyance with it, so I do understand the detractors of this stage, and I'm actually not trying to persuade you otherwise. I can see why anyone would hate this stage, and I can also see how the uniqueness of it can make it stand out to others, because both things were a little true for me. This definitely isn't one of my favorite stages of Sonic CD, but I also see its merits. I think the question I'd ask is, what ways could you keep this same concept of a spring that rockets you into dead ends, making you need to work your way back down, but improve the stage? Perhaps, rather than nearly the entire bottom floor of Act 1 being this springy floor, it's only in sections. Or there could be portions like the Egg Razor boss where players need to spring to the top, but by using other objects that are bouncing up, creating an interesting platform challenge. Or the entire stage could be designed like a staircase, with players starting at the bottom step and the front of each step being hazardous or leading to dead ends by springing players to the ceiling, with the back of each step springing players to the next step up. Granted, that could lead to a map size that's far too big for the capacity of the Sega CD, but I'm just throwing out some concepts here, and I do wonder, for those of you who hate this stage, if there's a way this concept might have worked better for you. Make it through wackiness galore, and players will reach Robotnik in his Egg Razor. For this fight, players will need to bounce into the Egg Razor once, which will make it drill into the ceiling, causing ceiling tiles to drop. Players will then need to hop on the ceiling tile as the ground gets electrocuted, and be bounced upwards. The weight will make the current one Sonic is standing on not bounce quite as high, meaning players will have to do some minor platforming. After a couple sequences of this, a couple easy to avoid spikes will drop before the ceiling tiles, and players will bounce up to hit Robotnik a final time, destroying his machine, or, as I learned the hard way, if they try to platform across, risk being crushed in between the bouncing ceiling tile and the ceiling itself. This is another clever fight in utilizing the actual stage concept of bouncing from the ground. It's pretty simple, not at all being a fight, like most of the previous boss battles, and does then ask the question of if this is more interesting than a boss fight version. Because I can see a version of this fight where Robotnik travels back and forth across the screen with some sort of projectile he drops on players, and players only being able to reach and hit him through bouncing from the ground. Or he has some shield on his bottom and sides, meaning players would have to ride a tile up to him and jump off to bounce on his head. I'm not saying one concept is better than the other, but I do think that latter concept I mentioned is what we'd see in Sonic's 1, 2, or 3, and it's interesting to see this fight that's probably actually a little more creative, granted not particularly challenging. My biggest strike against this concept is that I don't think there's any true replay value in this. Once you know the pattern of what to do, it's always the same thing, no matter what, as there's no variation to this fight. The tiles and spikes fall in the exact same spot, so once you know this fight, it's a bit of waiting around to do something routine. Defeat the Egg Razor, and players will reach Stardust Speedway, Sonic CD's take on Starlight Zone. Stardust Speedway is the roller coaster stage of Sonic CD, just like Starlight Zone. And like Starlight Zone, this is an easier stage, probably meant as a bit of respite that falls before the final stage and final challenge. While I think Stardust Speedway is a bit of a fan favorite, there are things that I really enjoy about this stage, and things that sort of bother me about it from a player readability standpoint that honestly hampers my opinion of the stage. Unlike Starlight Zone, while Stardust Speedway is a roller coaster, which will see Sonic doing plenty of fun and interesting looping, Stardust Speedway is also a maze. There are far more tracks players can find themselves on, with these tracks weaving amongst themselves with the other main gimmick of the stage at play. That gimmick being these signs players can flip that will turn on and off certain colliders of the tracks. So, a track in front of you, above you, or below you might be a wall with a collider if the ball signpost is flipped a certain way. But flip that signpost, and suddenly that wall will have no collision data and Sonic can run through. Or vice versa if you want to create a wall or flooring by hitting the ball. This is a cool concept that I happen to like, but I do think it has a readability issue. There is zero way to distinguish if what you're running to is going to have collision data or not. And similarly, while it's usually clear which portion of the track will have its collision data flipped when the ball signpost is flipped, it isn't always clear, and that's also a problem. So you might be running forwards with Sonic expecting to pass through something, only for it to completely stop you in your tracks, which can especially be an issue if you're trying to time travel. Or you might have the reverse, where you're expecting to go up a ramp-like portion of this track, only for it to turn out that portion of the track is turned off and you'll run right through. If you notice, there are certain portions of the track that are darker, which you'd think would indicate something behind the player, and portions that are brighter, which typically indicates it's in front of the player or at the same level of the player. This is the sort of thing I think should have shifted based on what track was turned on or off to serve as a genuine visual indicator for the player. I'm going to cut the team a little slack and assume this is a hardware issue. Flipping on and off collision data probably isn't too difficult, but perhaps swapping sprites would have either taken up too much memory, meaning it would slow the game, or simply been a space issue of how much data they could fit on this. I would guess the larger issue, as Sonic CD was on a CD, would be loading in the sprites every time this flips with no slowdown or loading, but I'm honestly not sure here. Now, the team does try to provide some help with this, and that's by using the signposts themselves. If you notice, flipping the signpost will either put it in front of a background element or behind that background element. It's a nice attempt at helping to make this a little more clear, but because the section that switches isn't clear, it doesn't end up being too useful, at least it didn't for me. This isn't something that breaks the stage for me, it's still fun to play through, and look, yes, it's obvious that if I ran into a wall and there's a ball signpost near me, I can hit that to turn off that wall. Hitting the ball also puts Sonic in the background of certain grates the team created to try to add to this clarity issue, so you can also keep track of, are you in front of these elements or behind them once you realize this. But I do think in a fast-moving game like Sonic, there probably should have been something a little more. On the positives, there are plenty of sequences where players will naturally shoot forwards into all sorts of interesting loops, with the tracks turning on or off as you go, creating a really cool effect with former tracks you ran or bounced through immediately transforming into a new path. There's these sequences where Sonic will automatically bounce through the stage, with players simply pressing the direction they want to shoot off at. While there's not much gameplay to it, it is a cool visual spectacle. I also love this giant Robotnik in the background near the end of Act 2. While I do have complaints about this stage, that's not to take away from the fact that it is fun to play through. It's not as easy flowing as a stage like Starlight Zone, with it asking a little more of players, making it feel a little more stop and go. That is necessary to create more challenge with the time travel aspect, and it's something I don't mind, but I do think that might be the determining factor for which stage you happen to prefer. A roller coaster that's pretty straightforward, where you can just watch Sonic go, or a roller coaster that's more maze-like, with a lot of interesting routes, but much more stop and go. For finishing Stardust Speedway, players will reach Metal Sonic. I think it's interesting to compare Metal Sonic to Mecha Sonic of Sonic 2, as the two characters are similar, in theory, but from a boss design standpoint, couldn't be more different. I talked about Mecha Sonic quite a bit in my Sonic 2 video, but to boil it down, this is a traditional memorization battle. Players have 0 rings, and Mecha Sonic will perform the same pattern every single time, so while there's no room for error on multiple attempts, players should be able to easily defeat him as he never changes. So, Sonic 2 has a fight sequence, and Sonic CD, instead, has a race sequence. The idea is that a gate will open, and Sonic has to beat Metal Sonic to the finish line where Amy is held hostage. Really though, it's less of a race and more of a keep away from Robotnik and Metal Sonic at a decent pace. Once the race starts, Robotnik will begin slowly chasing the 2 Sonics with a beam that will instantly kill Sonic if players fall too far behind. Not particularly a big deal, as there's a free 1-up at the beginning of the stage, so the team who made Sonic CD clearly decided they didn't want this race to be too stressful, as players essentially have infinite attempts, even though this is a lives-based game. Metal Sonic doesn't truly race Sonic though, and acts more like a yo-yo. He'll move forward at a general speed that Sonic can outrun, and on a timer, perform one of 2 attacks. If players are in front of Metal Sonic, he'll boost forwards, blasting in front of Sonic, and knocking Sonic back if he hits him. But if Sonic is behind Metal Sonic, then Metal Sonic will instead slow down even further with an electric shock attack, which is really just him drifting forward slowly with a small AoE around him. I should mention here, speedrunners can technically outrun Metal Sonic the entire time, which is a nice detail, but I think most players will experience this yo-yoing effect where they'll be in front, then behind, then in front, etc, etc. To complicate the race a little bit further, the pathway the 2 characters race on has several slopes that will send Sonic more vertical, slowing him down. On top of that, there are multiple spikes throughout, which are more often a hazard to run into rather than jump on, as they'll completely stop Sonic's momentum. Metal Sonic will obliterate these spikes if he runs into them, making for a clear path if players are behind. This really seems meant to create that yo-yoing idea and try to make the race feel like just that, a race. As I mentioned, you actually can run past Metal Sonic the entire race, so these obstacles are purposefully placed to make players lose their momentum, so Metal Sonic's boost can push past Sonic, and so players can easily catch up once the spike obstacles are destroyed. Finally, there are platforms above that players can jump to if they time it out correctly, which will take them to a far safer area, and one that can lead to a much easier victory over Metal Sonic. Because Robotnik slowly closes in on the 2 Sonics, it does force players into participating in the race, rather than cheesing it and staying behind Metal Sonic until the very end. If players win the race, Metal Sonic will run into the checkpoint wall and get destroyed. While that yo-yoing the team created adds to the intensity of a race in some ways, there is another notable aspect to what this yo-yoing does. Only the end of the race truly matters, as not only is this when Robotnik is most likely to close in on you, but Metal Sonic will slow down for players, ensuring they'll automatically win. All of this means there's a bit of an illusion of a race here, and while I do like this concept, I would have rather have seen a version with multiple tracks to run on and less obvious yo-yoing, maybe even allowing skilled players who aren't quite at speedrunner level to truly get ahead. Something you could also take away from this race is that it can be a memorization fight in a different sort of way from Mecha Sonic, where players are going to be memorizing the racetrack itself. Bringing back Mecha Sonic, of the 2, I do think Metal Sonic's is the more interesting battle. Even though I appreciate that Mecha Sonic's battle allows players to get multiple hits in per attack sequence, allowing for a larger skill cap, and definitely preventing as much waiting around, ultimately, I don't find memorization fights all that fun. Whereas, even though there's an extent of memorizing the race course in Sonic CD, it feels much more reactionary with Metal Sonic using his 2 attacks, and players needing to react to this on top of their race course memorization. Mecha Sonic is somewhat the culmination of multiple traditional boss battles, whereas Metal Sonic is another unique idea in a game that says, Sonic isn't about battling, it's about running and platforming. So here's a fight that's actually a platform sequence, which is a cool way to merge the concept of a boss fight with the actual stage-to-stage gameplay mechanics of Sonic. So, while I have some critiques of the way the Metal Sonic race was handled, I do, personally, crown it victor of the 2 mechanized Sonic battles, and once again, appreciate the team's creativity for its boss battle. After rescuing Amy and defeating Metal Sonic, players will reach the final stage of Metallic Madness. Like the final stages before, Metallic Madness ups the challenge with more dangerous obstacles than the prior stages. Although, even then, it's nowhere near as challenging as Scrap Brain Zone of Sonic 1 or Metropolis Zone of Sonic 2. The two acts here are fairly different and a little less consistent than the prior stages from Sonic CD. Act 1 is probably the more traditional of the two stages, with a larger focus on crushing blocks, spike traps, enemies who are a little more dangerous, and these twirling blades that shift in and out which height they attack. Additionally, there are slightly ramped up platforming challenges, with blocks that will occasionally spin, dropping Sonic, and blocks that phase in and out of existence. Meanwhile, Act 2 brings back the spinning wheels of Scrap Brain Zone for its opening sequence, but afterwards, the challenges feel a little more exploratory, with the stage really focusing on seeing if players can figure out how to platform from one element of the stage to the next element. There's also this laser that shrinks Sonic into a cute chibi Sonic. While this is a cute idea, it's only for one short sequence and doesn't really affect anything. The platforming is the same as if Sonic was normal sized, and I think there are multiple missing opportunities with this concept. As Sonic CD is about exploration, it would have been more interesting if large and mini Sonic could travel in the same areas, but there were jumps only normal Sonic could make, and smaller openings only Chibi Sonic could pass through. I think that would make for a more dynamically interesting area, and ask a little more of players in terms of how they can explore to progress. On top of that, something making Sonic smaller does is open up the types of challenges you can use. Because Sonic is so much smaller, you can fill the screen with more challenges, or platforming sequences, or obstacles, and have that feel much more fair than if the same sequences were in a normal sized stage, because you can see it all at once. So from a platforming or enemy challenge perspective, this idea also doesn't reach its potential. Another fun concept is this spinner that puts Sonic in the background or foreground of the stage, with certain enemies or obstacles only affecting Sonic depending on where he is. There was probably a little more that could be explored with this concept as well, but it's still a fun idea as it's currently used. In terms of the robot transporters, I do like how these stages are handled. I like that you can use the spinning gear to travel to the past in Act 2, and that the robot transporter there is found through genuine exploration, and not just sitting somewhere in the open. As far as Act 1 goes, the robot transporter is in a section of the stage that's blocked off in the present. This is a fantastic cue for any player, as if you're re-exploring the sections you saw from the present, you'll probably notice this giant new area you can explore, and realize that's likely to be where the robot transporter is hidden. I'm honestly having trouble deciding how I feel about Metallic Madness. In some ways, I found it underwhelming as there wasn't too much challenge to it, which, to be fair, could be exactly what some players love about the stage. I think with Act 1, a lot of the challenges presented were ones I feel like we'd seen before, but done in more interesting challenges in the other games. And in Act 2, there were some interesting ideas, like the shrinking laser beam, but it's not used in a particularly interesting way. I didn't mind exploring the stage, and I didn't have a bad time in it, so I guess it feels somewhat middling to me. For making it through Metallic Madness, players will reach the Egg Spinner. But before I get to the boss itself, I want to talk a little bit about Metallic Madness Act 3. I've been kind of skipping over these little mini stage sequences before the boss, because they're just that, and kind of just filler with a chance for players to get rings, lives, or other things they might want before the boss attempt. But something I found pretty notable here is that this is the first stage with an insta-death pit, and because there's no warning, there's no way to know this exists, and it only shows up in the final act, it feels pretty unfair to me. It also happens to be under some spinners that will drop players if they mess up their jump timing, so it could be a total shock that there's such a major consequence here. Players can get a 1-up right at the beginning of the stage, so this still isn't hugely consequential if players do explore and find that, but my issue with this is the nature of not knowing this could be an obstacle, because it's only ever done here, at the very end. There are several times throughout Sonic CD that players will be dropping from massive heights, so there's no reason players should suspect that a drop will kill them by this point. for making it through what could actually be one of the most difficult timing challenges in the entire game, where players will have to time out jumping from spinning platforms to make it through a crusher during an opening before it could crush them. Players will first reach a mini-boss in a series of lasers they'll have to destroy. There's not much to it though, so let's move on to the Egg Spinner. The Egg Spinner is a traditional Sonic boss fight. Here, Robotnik will move back and forth spinning this square blade before slowly dropping down towards the ground. This will give players a chance to jump into him, which will pop off one of the blades and make it easier to hit him the next time. When he only has 2 blades left, the pattern will slightly change, with him first shooting out the 2 blades into the ground before eventually dropping again. Finally, when he only has 1 blade left, after shooting it out, he'll then pogo stick off of it, bouncing from one side of the screen to the other. For hitting him 4 times and destroying all of the blades, Sonic will destroy the Egg Spinner and beat Robotnik for good. The boss concept itself is okay, but it does feel a little lacking. He spins these blades around him, but it doesn't actually mean anything, and it seems like that should have been a part of his attack. On top of that, I've seen criticisms online that this fight was a little underwhelming, and I have to agree with that sentiment. This is the final boss fight of the game, and it's both simple and not visually all that interesting. I'm not asking for an insanely difficult boss fight, but this one was so quick and easy. When I beat the game, I was actually surprised. I've played Sonic CD before, but I'd completely forgotten this was the final boss, and my initial reaction was, that's it? I'm done? Sonic CD's boss fights mostly haven't been about battling, so I wouldn't expect a grand battle here. But it is interesting then, in a way, that after trying to deviate so much from traditional fights, the final boss is a traditional fight. So even in that way, it feels a little underwhelming, because the team didn't try to do anything more creative that played off of Sonic's normal gameplay mechanics, like they tried to do with the prior bosses. I will say, for me, and to my taste, I don't think either Sonic team really got the final boss battles down until Sonic 3, and then again in Sonic and Knuckles. But, to be fair to this fight, if it was something as challenging as the final boss fight from Sonic 2, that would be so incredibly out of place in Sonic CD. For defeating the Egg Spinner, the Metallic Madness area will explode, and Sonic will escape with Amy. And then, we're treated to the true reward of Sonic CD, another absolutely fantastic animated sequence. Players will see Little Planet break away from Robotnik's control, and then, explode? And afterwards, as the credits play, my favorite animated sequence from Sonic CD, where we get these really cool animated takes of Sonic at the different stages from the game. That all culminates in this awesome scene of Sonic racing Metal Sonic. If players fail to destroy all of the robot transporters or collect all of the time stones, Little Planet and Robotnik's chain will reappear. If they succeed, stars will rain down, creating a nice set of flowers. I will say, while I think the implication is supposed to be that Little Planet vanishes, as it wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Neverlake when it was, it definitely visually looks like it exploded, and Sonic is a villain who blew up the entire planet through the chain reaction of destroying Robotnik's base. I mean, I know that's not supposed to be what happened, but it's what it looks like. One more thing to touch on before wrapping up is that Sonic CD has one additional feature that adds a nice bit of replay value, and that's a brand new time attack mode. While, of course, players could do this on their own anyways and keep track of their time, it's nice that there's a dedicated mode for this. After beating a stage, you'll then unlock that stage in time attack and be able to keep track of your best times or attempt to see if you can slightly edge yourself out. Because you can choose each stage in any order you want, this then makes it far easier to truly master any stage, and I think that's one of the best parts of this. This is such a natural feature to have in the Sonic game. After all, Yuji Naka expressed part of his intent with the programming and gameplay design of Sonic was for players to be able to replay stages over and over again to complete them faster and faster. So, a great addition to Sonic CD. The one thing though, is this is yet another thing that makes it seem like the robot transporters and exploration were the afterthought, even though the stages were designed around them. Sonic CD is an interesting Sonic game to me, because the more I've played it, the more I've warmed up to it, and I do think that seems like a fairly common take on Sonic CD. But I do think it has a bit of an identity crisis going on, and there's a lot of great ideas flowing throughout Sonic CD that I wish had been further realized. While allowing players to choose if they want to play the game like a traditional Sonic game, or the more exploratory route is a great idea for opening the game up for a larger range of players, I do think that choice hampers the overall design of Sonic CD, and I would have loved to have seen a version of this game that went all in on its exploration and time travel concepts. I liken this to Dark Souls and the From Software games a little bit, in that those games have a reputation for being challenging. But instead of creating on-the-surface easy modes, they're uncompromising on their vision, and I think that's why they've grown the massive fan base they have. The games force players to play by their rules, and because of that, many players who would have chosen not to, if they were given the choice, ended up having a much better experience for it. With Sonic CD, because players have so many options, and they can choose to never interact with the robot transporter route of the game at absolutely no cost, it means that many players will never experience that version of Sonic CD. But is that a good thing? Would the game have been better if the team only allowed players to play the exploration version of the game and designed every aspect around that? I don't know the answer, of course, but I do think that's the game I would have wanted. Like the time travel mechanic and exploration of Sonic CD, the boss battles are also totally unique in their creative take on trying to be more akin to the actual stage gameplay of Sonic CD. Some of these ideas are executed well, but others feel like they need a little more work. This is another area where I appreciate the creativity and ideation, but I wonder what the next level of this could have been. I actually think Sonic 3 and Knuckles has some concepts that are a nice merger and feel like what the team was going for, like the Egg Scrambler at the end of Mushroom Hill Zone, where players need to run and jump over obstacles while also attacking this. There's a lot to love about Sonic CD. The time travel mechanic is unique and makes sense for Sonic the Hedgehog. The game offers the most exploration I think I've seen in a 2D Sonic game, with stages built around that. There are 2 soundtracks that modern versions of the game let players freely choose to use while playing. Metal Sonic is introduced here, and the opening and ending cutscenes are fantastic. So I understand the love, and I understand the hate. I happen to fall somewhere in the middle, but where do you stand and why? And I do wonder if you love this game, if you do see some of the flaws I brought up. Because my takeaway doing this same sort of video for Mega Man 3, which is my favorite game in that series, was that while there were plenty of flaws I found, for me, the sum of the parts added up to more, and that could very well be the case for you. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, this is actually my 3rd video breaking down the classic Sonic games, so if you haven't seen those, maybe you'd like those as well. Additionally, I've been doing the same thing for the classic Mega Man series, and just recently finished my video on Mega Man and Bass, bringing me to 9 completed Mega Man analysis videos. Finally, I've actually been working on my own game, ChivalBee. ChivalBee is an action platform game inspired by classic games like Mega Man, Sonic, and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. My friend and I have been hard at work on it for around 3 years at this point, and we still have quite a ways to go. But if it looks at all interesting to you, we'd love if you followed us on our YouTube channel, Ophidian Interactive, for updates as they come. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace. Links.